for the 15th National Clinical Conference on Cannabis Therapeutics, which goes into great detail. So we thought it would be really good to have a Cannabis 101 course. We couldn't have gotten a better faculty together for you. But one of my, by the way, this is Patients Out of Time's mascot. I see she got away. Oh, you got her? I'm just going to. It's easier. This is Cola, for anyone who wants to know, if you can see her in the picture. I call her a therapy dog because she's there for everyone to pet as needed. And she will ask you for a pet if you don't give it to her. But anyway, Cannabis 101 today. Again, this is for those who don't have a basic understanding. We've got two fabulous clinicians who each have a book out on the topic. So I'd like you to go check that out. But main thing I want to know, for those who want continuing ed credits, for the healthcare professionals that want one, you should have this handout. We'll make sure it's available. And on the back, it gives you the instructions. We want you to complete an evaluation, and you'll get your continuing ed credits on there. So don't lose this. It's your guide to getting continuing education. So there are 2.75 CMEs available for this, physicians, nurses, pharmacists. So please do that. I don't want to take up any time because there's a lot that's going to go into your head on this. I'm going to first introduce Dr. Deborah Malka. She's coming to us from New Mexico. Excuse me. Thank you. Before I do that, I want to let everyone know, if you're coming to the conference, there is a reception. We always have a faculty meet and greet reception to start the networking process. That's one of the main things about our conferences is we bring these people here, the faculty enjoy meeting different folks, and of course the folks attending this conference want to meet and greet and discuss a few things with the faculty. That's going to be taking place at the Guild in Kansas City, a wonderful location. We're going to also have some vendors there. There will be music. So we hope you can all join us 6:30 to 9:30 tonight. We bring these people here. Okay. And while I'm here, I'm going to put in another plug. For those who might be interested, we have a benefit dinner for Patients Out of Time tomorrow night. And that will be from 6 to 10. 6 to 7 cocktails, and then 7 to 10. We've got Christian Fletcher. Excuse me, I always say that. Fletcher, Christian, and friends performing. We're very pleased to be in Kansas City. The locals all know that Kansas City is known for blues and barbecue. So tonight at the reception, we will be having some blues and barbecue on behalf of the Kansas City Blues Association. And then at the benefit dinner, we'll have Fletcher, Christian, and friends be playing for us. We'll have a live auction, great food, another great venue. That will be at the Midland. So we hope some of you might want to join us there. That is a separate event, the benefit dinner. You'd have to go to patientsoutofTime.com to sign up if you haven't yet. But other than that, again, apologize for my lapse there. But to get started, Dr. Deb Malka is coming up from New Mexico, PhD, MD. She's going to give an overview of the program, and then Dr. Dustin Sulak will continue with that. And you'll also hear from Cynthia Northcutt, a nurse, and JD, to give some of the legal implications about using cannabis. So welcome, Deborah.
Hi, thanks for being here. Guess I should speak into this. So there actually is no syllabus on a piece of paper, so I just want to review what's happening this afternoon. We try to do a pre-conference every Patients Out of Time because I have a very ordered mind, and knowing the basic chemistry and knowing some initial clinical practice tips really helps you get the most out of the conference, because our speakers at the main conference will talk about their area of specialty, but this is actually meant to be a course, a training module, so that you get those basics down, and that allows you to understand the more complex issues. I thought I was, I thought it wasn't working. Okay, so this is our training conference. We're going to start out with the basic science and clinically oriented basic science with Dr. Dustin Sulak. He's going to teach endocannabinoid physiology and cannabis pharmacology. And as you know, I hope all of you know, the endocannabinoid system is the most important part of our body's physiology as it relates to how we use cannabis, and it's essential to replace that paradigm that many of us have been taught, that cannabis is a drug of abuse, and replace it with this really core knowledge that it is a regulator of the endocannabinoid system. So that's first. Then we'll be followed by Cynthia Northcutt, who's an attorney and a nurse, and she specializes in cannabis medical legal practice here in Missouri, correct? And we thought that would be also essential for you to understand the liabilities and or ways to navigate the system if you're interested in doing that in this state. And then we're going to have a short break for about 10 minutes, hopefully, only. And then I'll be coming in with a review of the top 10 important conditions to know about clinically and some specifics about Missouri. And then we'll have a short 15-minute Q&A. We'll be done at 5. So thanks for being, oh, one more thing. If you have registered to be here, which I hope most of you have, you'll be eligible to get CMEs, or CEUs, sorry. If you have not registered, you will not be eligible to get CEUs. If you would like CEUs and you have not registered, please go up to the front desk and you can actually pay your dues after this wonderful presentation. Thank you. And here's Dr. Sulak.
Welcome, everyone. Glad to be here with you all in person. For a lot of us, it's been a while. So we're going to dive into endocannabinoid physiology and cannabinoid pharmacology. And the format of this is intended for clinicians. But I know one of the great things about Patients Out of Time is we always have a bit of a mixed audience. I think that's one of our strengths. And so I'll also do my best to translate this information to make it accessible to everyone. Like the plant is accessible to everyone, and to help us all share, and like Deborah said, to have a solid foundation for the rest of the conference over these next couple days. So a quick potential conflict of interest disclosure. I am an equity owner and employee of a company called Healer. We provide free patient education at healer.com. We also have cannabis and hemp products. We have paid industry training. We also do some consulting and extraction and formulation technology. I am formerly, within the last year, a paid scientific advisor for an analytic company called Forian. Also unpaid member of the board of directors of Society of Cannabis Clinicians. And if you're a clinician and you're not familiar with the SCC, I strongly encourage you to check out our group, which is getting more and more active. We have a lot of great offerings. And then the author of a book that came out last year, Handbook of Cannabis for Clinicians. This is what we'll be covering in the next hour or so. We'll do an overview of the endocannabinoid system, starting with the receptors, then getting into the compounds that our bodies make to target those receptors, and we'll tour a few of the systems in the body, the nervous system, including pain signaling, the immune system, and some of the effects in GI and metabolism. Any of these bullet points could easily be a whole day of discourse if we chose to, but this will be a good overview. We'll talk about what happens when the endocannabinoid system may not be functioning optimally, and then we'll look at some of the compounds from the plant and how they interact with our endocannabinoid system and other targets in the body. So we'll start here with a partial list of health conditions for which there's some clinical evidence that cannabis or the compounds in cannabis can be effective. And if you look at this list, you'll see examples of disease states from basically every field in medicine: psychiatry, rheumatology, gastroenterology, neurology, and so forth. And I think that when we any clinician that's kind of gone through conventional training and sees a list like this, we think, oh, this is, BS. How could this possibly be true that one plant could do so many different things? It seems very unlikely. And that was an important question that was asked for a long time. The answer came in the late 1980s and early 1990s when researchers investigating the action of THC in the body discovered something that later became known as the endocannabinoid system. So let's talk about the endocannabinoid system. It's a homeostatic regulatory system that's present throughout the body. Its main job is to help maintain resilience and balance in the state of stress and changing external environments at the cellular level. Now, there's been an enormous amount of research into this system. If you look at PubMed citations back in 1993, there were 10 citations for the term endocannabinoid. This year, over 11,000, almost 12,000. These are scientific papers that mention the term. And so if you think about that, that's like one paper every other day for the last 30 years, just about. It's a lot of information, a lot of investment in resources of time and energy and money into investigating this system. And why? Because it's such an excellent target for disease. Because it's this global homeostatic regulator of the other systems in the body. If we learn how to interface with this system, we can use it to affect all of those different disease states, including refractory conditions from every field in medicine. And that's what we do. So let's take a little deeper look at the components of this system, beginning with the cannabinoid receptors. These are the CB1 and CB2 receptors, and as you can see, if you're familiar with cellular receptors, these would be located in the outside of the cell membrane, and they're proteins. These have 7 passes across the cell membrane, characteristic of the G protein coupled receptor family of receptors. Here you can see a 2-dimensional image and a 3-dimensional image. The CB1 and CB2 receptors are very similar. CB2 is in gray in the 2-dimensional image and CB1 in black, but you can see there's some differences, and those differences show up in our tissues. So CB1 is primarily located in the central and peripheral nervous systems, but actually all over the body as well. I mean, both of these are widely distributed. You can see that CB1 is present in the connective tissues, like the fascia, adipose tissue, skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, liver, lungs, and so forth. CB2 is primarily located in immune cells, also found in the bones, also found in the CNS. It's a bit controversial whether CB2 exists in the healthy central nervous system, but certainly when the nervous system becomes inflamed or injured, we see upregulation and production of CB2 receptors there. And then also in the enteric nervous system, the nervous system of the gut. In addition to these outer cellular membranes that I just described, the CB1 and CB2 receptors have been found in other places inside the cell, including on the mitochondrial membrane, where they seem to have a role in regulating ATP or energy production and cellular respiration. They're found in other organelles, the endoplasmic reticulum, endosomes, lysosomes, and cell nuclei, and we don't really understand what they're doing there, but probably something. Now, if you take a look at PET CT combination of the human brain, or PET MRI, excuse me, you can see there's a distribution of CB1 receptors really all over the place there. There's some areas that have more CB1 receptors. So, for example, would be like where the red areas are, so the limbic part of the brain, some of the motor centers of the brain, cognitive areas of the brain. All of these areas where we see the most CB1 receptors correlate with functions that we see altered when people consume THC, like motor function or memory function or mood and emotion. Here, and what I wanted to mention here is that if you take all of the other different G protein receptors or cell membrane receptors in the brain, including, say, like dopamine receptors, serotonin, GABA, glutamate, all those different neurotransmitters, there's more CB1 receptors in the brain than any of them. It's truly a high population of this protein in the brain. CB2 receptors found throughout the periphery. Here you can see them in high abundance in the liver, in the lymphatics, skeleton, the spleen. And so, again, like this is just a system that is ubiquitous throughout the body. It's really found everywhere. And when we interface with the system, we're interfacing with our whole system, our whole body, maybe more than our body, mind, spirit. And it's a very old physiologic system. So the CB receptors have been around in animals for around 600 million years. If you look at a very primitive chordate, the sea squirt, it has a CB receptor that's almost identical to the human CB1 receptor, which means this has been important. This is something that animals have been doing for 600 million years, and it has not been selected against, it's been selected for. So this is a high level of evolutionary conservation. And compared to 600 million years, the cannabis plant is believed to have evolved around 34 million years ago. So animals were using cannabinoids long before cannabis came around. Now, we don't just have the CB1 and CB2 receptors so that we can respond to cannabis. There's probably some endogenous reason that we have these receptors, and that was discovered in 1992 and 1995, the endocannabinoids, as they're now called. The first one, anandamide, Sanskrit word ananda, that's what it was named after, and later 2-arachidinyl glycerol, or 2-AG. So these are pictured in their molecular forms. They look a bit different than THC, for example, but from a molecular structure, but they have a similar function. In the nervous system, they serve as retrograde messengers, and I'll show you more in subsequent slides what that's all about. Elsewhere in the body, they're produced as autocrine and paracrine mediators, which means a cell will produce these. They'll act either locally on the receptors on that same cell or on neighboring cells, and then they'll be degraded. Some of them do circulate in the body, and it's believed that there are some more global systemic endocrine effects of the circulating endocannabinoids. As I mentioned, they're synthesized on demand. Their precursors are omega-6 fatty acids, which are essential fatty acids. We need to get them from our diet. And they're rapidly degraded by these two enzymes primarily, Pha and MAG lipase. And so interacting with these enzymes could change the levels of endocannabinoids in the body and may have some therapeutic effects. Now, this is just a summary lecture. I want to point out those are the two main endocannabinoids. There are many other endocannabinoid-like compounds whose function is not very well understood, but growing all the time, and it's just not worth us talking about this. What I want to leave you with is the trends of how the system functions in the body, knowing that you have not seen all the details, all the specifics. The endocannabinoids don't just target the CB1 and CB2 receptors. There's many other targets in the body where these compounds act. GPR55, which is prevalent in the brain. The TRPV1 receptor, this is the so-called capsaicin receptor after it's the compound in hot chili peppers, which stimulates it, useful for treating pain and inflammation. The PPARs, these are receptors that are located on the cell nucleus, so not on the outer membrane, but inside the cell. These are receptors that control the turning on and turning off of genes. And primarily, it's the ones that cannabis affects have to do with pain and inflammation and metabolism. The cannabinoids also target voltage-gated ion channels and ligand-gated ion channels. So you can see there's a very complex system. Now let's go to the nervous system now. We're in the brain. This is a very simplified diagram of what's happening in the synapse, the communication zone between two neurons. And you can see in red what you're probably familiar with, this idea of an anterograde transmission, where basically the presynaptic nerve is depolarized. These neurotransmitters that are stored in vesicles, they're released. Those act upon the postsynaptic cell, and that causes an effect in that cell. And that's what we're kind of used to seeing. The endocannabinoid system works the other way. The endocannabinoids are not stored in vesicles. They're synthesized on demand. Instead of going forwards across the synapse, they go backwards. And when they get there, that's where they find the CB1 receptors. So why are cells doing this? What's the function of this retrograde signaling? Well, we can start here with a couple pictures. This would be an example of an excitatory synapse. What you're seeing here is that after that action potential came down that presynaptic nerve, calcium came into that nerve terminal that caused the release of glutamate, an excitatory neurotransmitter. Eventually, that's going to stimulate the glutamate receptor on that postsynaptic cell. That's going to open some calcium channels, and that influx of calcium is going to create a downstream effect in the postsynaptic cell. Eventually, when that signaling becomes strong enough, the postsynaptic cell is going to synthesize an endocannabinoid, in this case 2-AG, and that's what's going backwards across the synapse to stimulate that CB1 receptor, which closes the presynaptic calcium channels and prevents further release of that neurotransmitter, glutamate. So this is called depolarization-induced suppression of excitation, meaning that the cannabinoid system is kind of putting the brakes on, turning off that excitation that's coming from that presynaptic nerve. Now, if we change the diagram from glutamate to GABA, this would be called depolarization-induced suppression of inhibition, because GABA is an inhibitory neuron. So you're starting to get the picture that this is a signal from the postsynaptic cell to the presynaptic cell saying, wait, don't send any more of that over. Now, if we have stimulatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters and the same system controlling them, you begin to see how this is really a balancing act in the body, that this is functioning all the time to create balance in our nervous systems. Not only for the purpose of regulating neurotransmitter release, the endocannabinoid system is, well, I should say not only for that purpose, but as a part of that purpose, the endocannabinoid system modulates neuroplasticity via multiple mechanisms. On this slide, you can see the two I mentioned earlier, depolarization-induced suppression of excitation and inhibition. The endocannabinoid system also modulates neurogenesis, the actual growth of new nerves, and two other processes involved in neuroplasticity, long-term potentiation and long-term depression. Now, what's neuroplasticity? We have it in our lives all the time. When you watch a baby learn how to move its body, or when you watch somebody recover from a stroke who couldn't talk or walk and they learn to do that again. I mean, just millions or maybe billions, I don't know how many new neuronal connections are being produced rapidly during those times. More subtle types of neuroplasticity, like subconscious acquisition of some behavioral traits from the people you spend time with, or emotional traits from the people that you're close with, gaining a new skill. All of these are neuroplastic events. The endocannabinoid system is also highly involved in neural protection, meaning protecting the brain from injury. Anandamide and 2-AG are endogenous neuroprotective agents that we produce upon chemical and mechanical trauma. So in basically every type of brain injury that's been studied, it's been shown that mammals, at least, and it's believed that humans are the same way, will produce very high levels of these endocannabinoids because they protect against that injury, prevent the extent of the damage, and can speed the healing. Delta-9 THC, CBD, anandamide, and 2-AG, as well as the synthetic cannabinoid HU210, have all been shown to decrease glutamate excitotoxicity. One of the things that can happen in a brain injury is that more and more glutamate can be released from the injured and dying nerve cells. That becomes toxic to the surrounding cells, and then they start to leak glutamate, and things just get too excited in the brain. All of these compounds have been shown to reduce that, to reduce seizure activity, to limit the size of a stroke after it happens. Cannabinoids have also been shown to be effective at reducing and preventing perinatal brain injury. So from when babies are born and they have a lack of oxygen, it's a really opportune time to protect the brain and really change the course of somebody's life. Moving on, in the nervous system still, we'll talk about the autonomic nervous system. Autonomics are the part of our nervous system function that we don't usually have to think about. We have two branches of the autonomic system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic is thought of as the fight or flight nervous system, parasympathetic, the rest and digest. That's a major oversimplification. But anyways, in the sympathetic nervous system, the CB1 receptors, when they're stimulated, they inhibit norepinephrine release. They've been shown to dampen sympathetically mediated pain and to modulate the HPA and the HLN axes, which are the way that the brain communicates with the adrenal glands to produce things like cortisol and indirectly adrenaline. In the parasympathetic nervous system, CB1 again is reducing elevated activity, which is thought to be the mechanism of action of the anti-nausea effects of cannabis, or at least of the THC in cannabis. And so here you can see, again, like 2 examples of when the body's doing something excessive, too much fight or flight activity, too much rest and digest activity to the point of salivating and almost about to vomit. The endocannabinoid system will suppress that excessive activity. Moving on in the autonomics, a major part of what the autonomics do is control our blood vessels and our cardiac function. There are CB1 receptors in the muscle of the heart, which can have differing effects on heart rate and cardiac contractility. It can increase it or decrease it. Vascular tissue has CB1 receptors. Activating that usually causes vasodilation. Those are both via the relaxation of the smooth muscle cells, as well as a nitric oxide mechanism from the endothelium. The cannabinoids have been shown to produce antihypertensive or blood pressure lowering effects in humans. And there's been animal models of heart attack where administering cannabinoids like THC in tiny doses can prevent the extent of the damage. Now let's focus a little bit on the endocannabinoid system and pain. We'll start with preclinical models, animal models, studying activating the system, often with synthetic cannabinoids, but sometimes with endocannabinoids or plant-based cannabinoids, can have activity in all the different types of pain that are studied. So the ECS isn't particular to acute pain or chronic pain, inflammatory pain, or neuropathic pain. It seems to work everywhere. And early on, when researchers were looking to discover synthetic compounds that could stimulate CB1, they used this tetrad test to evaluate these different compounds, basically in animal models, mouse models. And one of the criteria for a drug that might be a potential CB1 agonist was analgesia. So it's this very basic aspect of what CB1 stimulation, and CB2 for that matter, can produce. The anti-nociceptive or anti-pain signaling effects of cannabinoids involve many mechanisms. We'll just cover a few in these slides, or actually let me remind myself if we cover them. I'll cover a few on this slide. So the descending pain inhibitory pathway, this is a way for our brain to send a signal down to the rest of the body to say, stop sending so much pain, turn that pain off. And that's really important when we're, say, in a situation where we have an injury and the pain is overwhelming, but we have to remove ourselves from that scene, from that situation to get ourselves safe. So we have to be able to turn that system on, but it also has to not be on all the time, or else it could be dangerous for us. By stimulating CB1 receptors in that system, it kind of takes the brakes off of that system and lets it do a little bit more to inhibit pain. There's also cannabinoid receptors peripherally in the terminal of the pain signaling nerves. So like say you stub your toe and it's hurting, there's cannabinoid receptors down there. And one of the mechanisms that prevents that acute pain from turning into long-term pain or chronic pain is the function of the endocannabinoid system to decrease that pain signal a little bit, suppress some of the activators and sensitizers of that neuron. The cannabinoid receptors are in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord where the pain is heading up to the brain. Stimulating them there also suppresses that signal. And then supratentorial sites referring to aspects of our brain that not necessarily feel the pain when it comes to the brain, but interpret the pain. So our kind of emotional response to the pain, the bothersomeness of the pain, and the behavioral aspects of our experience of the pain all can be mediated by the cannabinoids. It's also been shown that cannabinoids and opioids can work really well together. Our body actually uses them together. We produce endogenous cannabinoids. We also produce endogenous opioids, the endorphins and the enkephalins. And it's been shown that these receptors for the opioids and for the cannabinoids are present in the same areas of the brain that control pain signaling, and that they interact with each other. It's been shown in numerous animal studies that administering cannabinoids and opioids together results in a greater than additive anti-pain effect, meaning it's greater than the sum of its parts. There's a synergistic effect between cannabinoids and opioids. Our bodies know this. We're using this in our strategy for pain. It might make sense if we're thinking about that strategy from an external medicine point of view. And I know that opioids have gotten a really bad rap because of basically what humans have done to them, even though it's a plant that was put here on Earth like cannabis, and or evolved here on Earth like cannabis, and has a lot to offer our species in terms of reduction of suffering and compassionate use of that medication. So it makes a lot of sense to use cannabinoids and opioids together. Here's just some review data from 19 preclinical studies on the co-administration of these compounds. What they found was that the effective dose of morphine was 3.6 times lower when administered with THC compared to when it wasn't. The effective dose of codeine was 9.5 times lower when administered with THC. If we could see even a fraction of this synergy in our patients when we treat them with opioids, that would be really exciting. Well, the answer is it's there. Like study after study, most of them are observational and not the so-called gold standard randomized control trial. But again and again, we see this data coming out showing that patients with chronic pain that are using opioids that initiate using cannabis, somewhere around 40% of them are able to stop their opioids. Another 40% are able to reduce their opioid dosage and improve their symptoms and improve their function and quality of life. There's just so much data on that already. So in summary, what do we learn about endocannabinoid system in the nervous system? Retrograde synaptic transmission, remember that backwards across the synapse, a major role in neuroprotection, a role in neuroplasticity and learning, the regulation of the autonomic nervous system. And if any of you think of any of your patients and any of the conditions that any of your patients have, is there an influence of the autonomic nervous system on that condition or the symptoms it produces? Of course there is. Anti-nociception or anti-pain signaling, and synergy with the opioid system. Now let's move on from the nervous system to embryology. CB1 receptors are detected in mouse embryo as early as the second day of gestation. It's also been shown that for the blastocyst to implant into the endometrium, there has to be appropriate levels of anandamide there, not too little or not too much. So this endocannabinoid system is highly involved in the very beginning of life. The proliferation and differentiation of stem cells are shaped by extracellular cues provided by endocannabinoids. So this system has to be functioning for our nervous system and for the rest of the embryo to develop appropriately. This is a falsely colored image of a 6-day-old human embryo implanting itself into the wall of a womb. It's just incredible to think that that's what we all were at some point, and that initial function of finding and connecting with the womb was, at least in part, mediated by the presence of endocannabinoids in suitable levels. Was there a question on that point? Right, so a role in the suckling. So, and again, we see this kind of metaphor in endocannabinoid function. You'll see it again when we get to the metabolism part, but there's this kind of nutritive aspect to it, right? So blastocyst implanting on the endometrium and allowing that nutrition to flow. And then if you block CB1 receptors in newborn mice, they fail to suckle, they'll die. It's a part of our hunger response, part of our nutritive response and our connection to life. Endocannabinoids are very active in the bone, regulating osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So these cells are the ones that build bone and break down bone, and this remodeling process of bone is required throughout one's life to have healthy and strong bones and to heal from injuries. CB2 stimulation in the osteoblasts and osteoclasts seems to have opposite effects. So it'll suppress osteoclast activity and stimulate osteoblast activity. CB1 receptors are also present in the sympathetic terminals that innervate the bone, and it's the norepinephrine that's released that can suppress bone growth. This is thought to be one of the mechanisms in the pathophysiology of scoliosis. If there's this kind of asymmetrical sympathetic activity, the bones can grow asymmetrically. Oh, where are we going? Immune system. So T and B lymphocytes have CB2 receptors. there tends to be stimulation or modulation, we should call it, because it can increase or decrease the activity depending on what cell type and what the situation is, but controls or modulates the proliferation, so the growth of these cells and the death of these cells, modulates macrophage-mediated killing of sensitized cells, inflammatory cytokine production, and again, this would be suppression of excessive activity. Immune cell activation by inflammatory stimuli modulates chemotaxis, or the movement of immune cells based on chemical gradients, and the migration of inflammatory cells in the body. Now, there's trends in the immunomodulation with the stimulation of the CB2 receptors. There tends to be a decrease in the Th1 type of cytokines, decrease in metalloproteinases, and increase in the Th2 types of cytokines. And these are often associated with the problematic effects in autoimmune and rheumatologic diseases, and then also shown to increase subsets of BT and natural killer cells. Moving on to the digestive system, CB1 receptors modulate activity in the enteric nervous system in a similar way to the central nervous system. They can have an influence on gastric acid secretion, the tone of the lower esophageal sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach, intestinal motility, how fast things are moving, how sensitive the gut is to pain, and how inflamed the gut is. Now, CB2 receptors are also located in the gut. They are where you would expect them to be. They're in the lamina propria, in the plasma cells, and in the activated macrophages. This is the way that the gut, one way that the gut modulates its immune system. And they're so involved in the inhibition of inflammation, visceral pain, intestinal motility, especially more active in the inflamed gut. Endocannabinoid system controls hunger and metabolism. As I mentioned earlier, breast milk contains endocannabinoids, and these receptors are important for suckling in newborns. The endocannabinoid system modulates the metabolism of the cells via all of these other hormones, which have gotten a lot of attention in the last decade or two for regulating energy production and energy liberation, appetite, and satiety. Now, obesity can lead to an overproduction of the endocannabinoids by adipocytes, by the fat cells. And this can actually cause a problem that drives CB1 receptors into a feed-forward dysfunction. So it's thought that in obesity, with an overproduction of endocannabinoids, you can actually start to build tolerance, as almost analogous to building tolerance to THC. And this would downregulate CB1 receptors and cause a dysfunction in the endocannabinoid system that would then be less able to correct some of the problems there with obesity. So you can potentially get into a feed-forward dysfunction that contributes to metabolic syndrome, whereas that same system could be a target to treat metabolic syndrome. Now, it's interesting because THC, serving as a partial agonist at the CB1 receptor, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, it could theoretically correct both of those situations. Someone with obesity that has a downregulated endocannabinoid system, or someone in another situation that actually could use some stimulation of that system. In summary, the endocannabinoid system is widely distributed throughout the body. The primary function of the endocannabinoid system is cellular homeostasis. Our understanding of it is incomplete, emerging, and suggests significant complexity. We will be diving into that complexity over the next couple days, and I'm looking forward to that. Manipulation of the endocannabinoid system may provide effective treatment in a wide variety of diseases. And to drive that point home, I'm going to read this quote from a 2013 paper from two prominent authors at the NIH. Modulating endocannabinoid system activity may have therapeutic potential in almost all diseases affecting humans, including obesity, metabolic syndrome, diabetes and diabetic complications, pain, neurodegenerative, inflammatory, cardiovascular, liver, gastrointestinal and skin diseases, psychiatric disorders, cachexia, cancer, and chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, amongst many others. Just incredible. So having learned what you know about this system, it's an important question to ask, what happens when it may not be functioning right? Like, is it really doing its job to the best of its ability in all of us? What does that look like? Well, to begin with, there's been a surprising amount of research on the polymorphisms of the genes that code for the CB1 receptor especially. So there's different versions of this gene. Some of us may have little mutations that, based on outcome research, might make us more susceptible to these variety of conditions: schizophrenia, alcohol dependence, changes in body mass index, obesity, ADHD and PTSD, happiness, serum lipid profiles, and so forth. So looking at large populations of individuals that have these genetic polymorphisms in the CB1 receptor, one can potentially predict outcomes. And in those people that have these conditions, finding a way to restore balance to the endocannabinoid system might be a therapeutic strategy. Ethan Russo has published 2 papers on this topic, the most recent in 2016, Clinical Endocannabinoid Deficiency Reconsidered, and he visits migraine, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, and other treatment-resistant syndromes in this paper. Some of the thing that ties them all together is this hypersensitivity. These are all conditions where conventional medicine does a very poor job of treating them, doesn't really understand their cause. They're kind of too complex for the reductionistic black and white model that's prevalent in kind of the pharmacological approach to medicine. And so they're treatment resistant. But hypersensitivity is often a feature of people with these conditions, and cannabis seems to really help bring that into balance. Similar story with autism spectrum disorder, in which there can be also a lot of hypersensitivity. This is one example of a couple of papers that have shown that children with autism are likely to have lower levels of the endocannabinoids than their neurotypical controls or matched children that are neurotypical. Okay, so that's the endocannabinoid system, a great target for pretty much any disease, something that might not be functioning well in all of us. Let's take a look at one way of interacting with it. And of course, my favorite way, and I think probably the best, is the plant cannabis, which offers us not just one, but so many different compounds that can interact with this endocannabinoid system, as well as other targets in the body. And so we'll start with THC, which is a mimicker of our own cannabinoids, anandamide and 2-AG, by acting as a partial agonist at CB1 and CB2 receptors. Just some of the pharmacologic effects it can produce: analgesic, antipruritic or anti-itch, antispasmodic, antioxidant, bronchodilatory, neuroprotective, anti-inflammatory, anti-nausea, psychoactive. There's many other targets in the body. This is just a small list because anything that CB1 or CB2 can do, THC can do with it. There's other targets for THC in the body. It's not just working on CB1 or CB2. And, some of these targets are better or less understood in how clinically significant they may be. But you can see some other G protein and nuclear targets and some of the TRP receptors, as well as some inhibition at some of the other membrane receptors. Now, moving on to CBD, close sister to THC, very similar molecule. If you look at their molecular structure, quite different activity, actually. It's also strange because there's a lot of overlap in what we see as the outcomes with CBD. They both can help with pain. They both can help with anxiety and mood and all sorts of overlap, but the mechanism is actually quite different in a lot of ways. CBD has a very low affinity for the CB1 and CB2 receptors. This is not thought to be its main mechanism of action. Unlike THC, which is a partial agonist, CBD is an allosteric antagonist of CB1 and CB2. What that means is that when something else is stimulating CB1 and CB2, like anandamide or like THC, CBD doesn't block that stimulation. It fits with a different site on the receptor, and it's like it turns down the volume a little bit. So THC or anandamide still gets to do what it's meant to do there, but it does so a little less loudly. It's also active in a lot of other areas in the cells, probably more than 40 or more than 60 that we know of. Some of the most clinically significant I've listed on this slide. So it activates the 5-HT1 serotonin receptor. This is thought to be the mechanism of its mood and anti-nausea effects. It activates the TRPV1 through 4 receptors, the PPAR gamma nuclear receptor, GPR18, the glycine receptor, which has a major role in the nervous system, antagonist of many other receptors, and then an inhibitor of the uptake of a variety of neurotransmitters, including anandamide. And so that's thought to be one of its mechanisms of action is through the inhibition of anandamide reuptake. And in the bullet point below that, you'll see also the inhibition of the Fa enzyme, which breaks down anandamide. These are 2 ways in which CBD can increase the levels of anandamide in the synapse or the circulating anandamide. And that could have indirectly a THC-like effect. CBD is also active in the mitochondria and much more. Here's a little graphical summary of some of the main effects of CBD that have been studied: the antispasticity, antidepressive, anti-anxiety, antipsychotic, anti-seizure, and anti-inflammatory properties. Now, I just had to say anti 6 times, which is one of the big problems with medicine and kind of research and how we think about these things, because instead of saying antispasticity, we could say muscle relaxant or mood enhancing. Or anxiety and fear reducing, or that would be anti. What can we say about that? Like safety and trust promoting, clear thinking, and so forth. Balanced immune system. Moving on, THC and CBD seem to work really well together. CBD has been shown to decrease the undesirable side effects of THC, like intoxication, sedation, rapid heart rate. CBD can also enhance some of the benefits of THC, the analgesic, antiemetic, and also the anti-cancer properties of THC. It's also been shown to reduce the munchies that THC produces, which might be appreciated by some people or maybe not so much by others. There have been some studies, though, that have shown that even very generous doses of CBD do not necessarily decrease some of the psychoactive effects of THC. This study showed that it did not reduce at 0, 200, 400, or 800 milligrams of CBD taken orally before smoking really low-quality NIDA cannabis. In 31 people on average, there was no big effect on the reinforcing physiological or positive subjective effects reported by those subjects from the low-quality NIDA smoked cannabis. I think this tells the story a little bit more, though. Clinically, here we have a comparison of the toxic psychosis threshold. So we're not talking about long-term psychosis, but when you give enough THC to someone, they'll transiently experience psychotic symptoms. And if you look at the studies on dronabinol, or brand name Marinol, this is just a synthetic THC, single molecule drug. The threshold on average is somewhere around 18 milligrams of THC. Someone who's not used to THC, give them around 18 milligrams. That's when you can start seeing some of these psychotic effects. Compared to Sativex, or Nabiximols is the brand name, this is a 1-to-1 roughly oral spray of THC and CBD. The threshold seen in those studies for toxic psychosis was up around 48 milligrams of THC. So more than double the THC was tolerated for this very severe side effect when given with roughly equal portion of CBD. Now, there are many other active constituents in cannabis. I've chosen a few more to talk about. It would, again, take us all day to cover all the interesting ones. There are terpenoids, there's flavonoids. The terpenes or terpenoids give cannabis its aroma. They have therapeutic effects. They've been studied, as many of you know, from the essential oils of other plants. Then there's the acidic cannabinoids, THCA, CBDA. These were long thought to be inactive precursors. Now we know they're very active, just in different ways. And then also, many of these compounds are antioxidant and antimicrobial. You know, it's one thing to think about what are their targets in the human body, but also to think about what the heck are they doing on the plant. Well, many of them are protecting the plant from infections and from pests and from ultraviolet light and from oxidation. So we'll go through just a handful of these, starting with CBG, which is recently available from hemp extracts. I think in the last couple of years we've seen CBG products become more popular and more clinically recognized and utilized. CBG readily crosses the blood-brain barrier. On CB1 and CB2, it's a little bit more like THC, but not as strong. It's a lower affinity by a factor of 5 to 27-fold, so similar activity, but not strong. Even high doses of it don't produce euphoria or strong psychoactive effects. It's also comparable to CBD at some of the ion channels, so it kind of looks like THC but weaker on some of the targets, looks like CBD on some of the other targets. One of its most interesting targets, I think, is this alpha-2 adrenoceptor, which is in the brain. It's part of the sympathetic nervous system, and stimulating this receptor decreases sympathetic nervous system activity. Similar mechanism of action as the drugs clonidine, which has many targets, but that's one of the things clonidine does, as well as guanfacine, which is used. So clonidine is a blood pressure medication, but it's probably the most off-label used drug around. It's used for treating withdrawal from opioids and benzodiazepines and alcohol. It's used for agitation and aggression and autism and in many other areas of medicine. Guanfacine is used in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and so as well as blood pressure, PTSD, dementia, and so forth. Therapeutic potential of CBG reviewed in a book chapter, which I found very helpful. And again, you can see some of these just wide-ranging conditions, including antibacterial. Many of the cannabinoids have been shown to be antibacterial. CBG seems to be the strongest. Now let's move on to THCV, which is starting to become available. THCV is a CB1 antagonist at low doses and a CB1 agonist at higher doses. So it kind of flips its activity depending on how much is consumed. It's been shown to produce weight loss, to decrease body fat and serum leptin concentrations with increased energy expenditure in obese mice. It has some anticonvulsant properties. It's been shown to decrease swelling and sensitivity to pain and to lack the adverse effect profile of the inverse agonists like rimonabant. So rimonabant, a CB1 blocker, was actually approved in Europe and about to be approved in the United States as an anti-obesity, anti-munchie drug until there were too many side effects, including suicides. THCV is a gentle blocker of the CB1 receptor. It doesn't block it strongly like rimonabant, and it doesn't seem to have any of those side effects. I mean, go figure that the plant would also produce something that has that benefit without those side effects. THCA I found extremely interesting in my practice. It is pharmacologically distinct from THC, even though the only difference is that one carboxylic acid group. It has little to no activity at the CB1 or CB2 receptor and does not seem to have any psychoactivity, but it has been shown to modulate the immune system, having anti-inflammatory effects, strong neuroprotective effects, even though barely any of it gets into the brain under normal circumstances. That could be increased during injury or disease. It's been shown to suppress tumor necrosis factor alpha, independent of CB1 or CB2. That's a major player in rheumatologic and inflammatory conditions, to scavenge free radicals, to inhibit breast and prostate cancer cell lines. So many functions of THC. I'll go over a few more. Anti-inflammatory, anti-fibrotic, meaning anti-scarring, in animal models of chemically and obesity-induced injury, including hepatic injury. It's been shown to reduce adiposity and prevent metabolic diseases via PPAR gamma. It's been shown in one study to kind of do the opposite of what CBD does, but to actually turn up the volume a little bit on the CB1 receptor. This is a positive allosteric modulator effect, which is very interesting. We've been seeing people clinically for years now claiming that products that are not fully decarboxylated, that have some THCA in there along with the THC, are more potent than the ones that have higher levels of THC. And I've wondered, what is that? And I've thought, well, maybe the THCA is inhibiting the metabolism or breakdown of THC, and that could be a part of it, but it might also be because it's turning up the volume on the CB1 receptor as a positive allosteric modulator. And then in vitro and ex vivo models of inflammatory bowel disease, THCA has worked well in those models as well. without the biphasic pro-inflammatory effects of CBD. CBD is often biphasic, meaning one dose does one thing, another dose does the opposite, but that opposite often happens at super high doses that we don't really see in humans. Anyways, in these models of inflammation in the gut, the CBD at a too high of a dose can actually have a pro-inflammatory effect. Doesn't seem like that happens with THCA. Now, anytime we think about THCA, there's always going to be a little bit of THC in there. It's 99% pure or 99% pure. You can never have zero THC in the presence of THCA. There'll always be a little. And maybe we think, well, that's so little, that probably doesn't mean anything. But I wonder, because I've seen some very interesting things happen with tiny, tiny doses of THC, almost like homeopathic doses of THC that you wouldn't believe, wouldn't expect. And so I wonder how often are these very low doses of THC a confounder in what we think we know about THCA. This dose, 0.002 milligrams per kilogram of THC, I'm not sure what the equivalent would be for humans, maybe a ninth of that. That might be like, rubbing a little THC on your lip or something like that, like a tiny little piece of the plant. I mean, it's a really small dose. That dose has been shown to produce cardioprotection in mice that were given a heart attack, protect the liver from ischemia reperfusion injury in mice, and to, just after a single dose, produce long-lasting activation of protective signaling molecules in the brain. So maybe a little THC and a very little THC and a little THCA together is a great combo, and there's no way to separate them. But we just don't know exactly what's happening there. CBDA is interesting. I've been very impressed with it clinically. Whereas THC and THCA are very different, CBD and CBDA are very similar. It shares the ability of CBD to activate the 5-HT1A serotonin receptor, but much stronger. It does not seem to act upon CB1 or CB2 receptors, so for some people, they don't want CBD to diminish the effects of the THC. They want the THC to really shine through. CBDA would allow that to happen. You could gain the benefits of CBD without inhibiting any of the effects of THC. It acts upon many of the same receptors, but it's been shown to be stronger at inhibiting the COX-2 enzyme, which produces inflammatory molecules, than CBD, THC, or THCA. It's also very well absorbed. The print is small. This is my last slide, so we'll wrap it up in just a minute here. But I wanted to point out how bioavailable this stuff is. First of all, CBD, in a model of nausea, CBD demonstrated anti-nausea properties in rodents at 5 milligrams per kilogram. CBDA was effective at 0.0005 milligrams per kilogram. And the dose-response curve was not biphasic, which it was for CBD. Go from 5 to 20 milligrams per kilogram of CBD, and you go from anti-nausea to pro-nausea effects. That was not seen to happen in the doses studied of CBDA. So, I mean, how many? 1, 2, that's like a thousandth, like 1,000 times more potent than CBD in that model of nausea. Again, you can see here 100 times more potent than CBD in a model of increased sensitivity to pain, and 10 times more potent than CBD in a model of seizures based on the Dravet syndrome. So, and barely any CBDA gets into the brain, but it's still 10 times as potent as CBD in reducing those seizures. I didn't show it here, but the bioavailability in humans has been studied of CBDA versus CBD, and CBDA is at least 10 times, but up to 30 times more bioavailable when taken by mouth. So you're getting a lot more of it into your blood, and then it's having a much stronger effect. So that is the summary of the endocannabinoid system and cannabinoid pharmacology. I know it was a lot. That was a whole hour. Be sure to get up and stretch. And thank you very much.
So we do have a short half-hour presentation to come and then a break. So You want to just kind of get up and stretch in your seats and breathe, and then we'll have an official break after Cynthia Northcutt comes up to speak. Thanks. Am I set up there? The next one?
Is this you?
No, I'm the one after.
Oh. It may be on this one, actually. I think you'll be in space bar. I don't think we'll need the juice, but it's here in case we do. All right, everything.
Testing. So that we can get out of here and get to the reception. There's a lot of information to cover. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you hear me now? All right. There's a lot to cover, and I'm going to go really fast. If you want the slide deck, shoot me an email, and I'm happy to send it to you. But there's a lot here, and so here we go. My name is Cynthia Northcutt. I'm an attorney and a registered nurse. I've been doing primarily cannabis law for about the past 5 years. I've been a nurse for 30 and a lawyer for 20. So I've done this for a minute. And we're going to talk a lot in the next 30 minutes. A lot of it is going to be a review, and a lot of it's going to be history, because I think the history of cannabis is important. We need to know where we came from in order to understand where we are now and predict where we're going to go. And this plant, being a state legal operator, is now possible in most states in the United States, either medical or adult use or both. But cannabis is still federally illegal, and people are still being incarcerated for it. And that's something that, as practitioners in the cannabis space, that's something that we all need to consider, is that until federal law changes, technically what we are doing is illegal. So know that and keep that in mind. There we go. Quick review of 8th grade civics. Basic concepts of American jurisprudence. Ooh, big word. The American legal system is based on federalism or decentralization. We have a federal government that has many different state governments, and the federal government is granted power to do what it does by the supremacy clause of the Constitution. And that basically says that the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, is the supreme law of the land. Judges in every state are bound to follow rulings, or to follow the Constitution. And the federal government gets to create, regulate, and enforce federal laws of the United States. The Constitution sets boundaries of federal law, and there are express powers and implied powers, and I'm sure everybody remembers this. Express or enumerated powers are, well, that's all right. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened. Oh, here we are. Okay, very good. Express powers are powers that are specifically enumerated in the Constitution. The right to regulate commerce, declare war, levy taxes. Implied powers are powers that are not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, but can be inferred from the Constitution or from the Bill of Rights. And that's important in cannabis because, and you may have heard this phrase before, a penumbra of rights. That refers to a group of rights that are not explicitly stated in the Constitution, but can be inferred from these other rights. And they use the definition of the scientific term of penumbra, which is basically the shadow of an eclipse. You have, the eclipse is dark, but everything that falls in the shadow of the eclipse is still considered the eclipse. It's still part of the eclipse. That's where we get this penumbra of rights. And there's a seminal case that dealt with this issue in 1965 called Griswold versus Connecticut. And you'll probably be hearing a little bit more about Griswold in the near future, because on June 7th of 1965, the Supreme Court issued a 7-2 decision holding a Connecticut state law that criminalized the use of contraception was unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court said that the right to marital privacy existed in the penumbra of rights under the Constitution. And that's where we get these implied rights, and the right of association from the First Amendment, the brilliant right of association from the First Amendment. Third Amendment, the government can't force you to quarter soldiers in your house. Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure. Fifth Amendment, self-incrimination. Ninth Amendment, which is kind of the catch-all, which says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain specific rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage any other rights retained by the people. So whether expressed or implied, federal law will almost always prevail when it interferes or conflicts with state law, except in circumstances where the federal law is unconstitutional or the supremacy clause doesn't apply. Cannabis is one of these areas of tension because federally it is still illegal. The doctrine of preemption, which, there we go. This is another issue. In the absence of federal law, or if there's a state law that provides more protections than the existing federal law, state law holds. Basically, states are considered to be plenary sovereigns, and the federal sovereign only has the limited supreme authority granted to it in the U.S. Constitution. And Missouri, or United States law is mostly state law, and it's a very complex set of relationships and rules that govern how federal and state laws work together and which ones control. That's an entire law school class, and trust me, yeah, we've said enough about it. Sources of laws. Where do we get our laws? Constitution, statutes, and common law, both federal and state. Constitution, those rights are rights that are of fundamental importance, things that are so important that we as a society felt that it was important to put them in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights. Statutes and administrative regulations, both federal and state. The legislative branch creates laws by enacting statutes, and legislatures can also create administrative bodies. Example, in Missouri, there are lots of different administrative, workers' compensation is an administrative organization that most states have, not all. Excuse me. But legislatures can create these administrative bodies and also come up with rules that clarify the statutes and give these administrative bodies their power. Common law is basically derived from judicial decisions. Originally, we kind of adopted English common law, but we've got over 250 years now of American jurisprudence, so we've actually come up with our own common law now. Civil law and criminal law, big difference. Civil law refers to settling disputes between parties, between individuals. Contracts, torts, family law, estates and trusts, probate. Criminal law is an offense against society. Those rules have been, again, codified as statutes or codes. They're prosecuted by the state or by the government because the offense is considered to be an offense against all of us as citizens. So I don't have to bring suit against somebody who breached a contract. If it's a criminal case, this person did something criminal, the state is going to stand for me, and the state is going to prosecute on my behalf if someone broke a criminal law. Generally, it's the state attorney general, prosecuting attorney in a local jurisdiction. The American legal system is based on the principle of stare decisis, which means that courts have to follow decisions of higher courts within the same jurisdiction. Case law from another jurisdiction can be persuasive, but it's not binding on another jurisdiction, and that is both state and federal. Case law it sets a precedent for future judgments, and more than anything, it allows consistency and predictability for us as citizens. It lets us know if I enter a contract with this person and they break it, what's likely to happen? Well, I look to the laws in my state and then look to the case law in my state. How has this issue been treated before in my state? Is it comparable? And can I expect the same treatment from the courts in this situation? In theory, you should be able to say yes. That's not always the case, but that's the theory behind it. Legal history of cannabis in the United States. There's a lot. We're going to go fast. You guys are going to get that from other people. Cannabis was available in the 1850s in American pharmacies, and government efforts to regulate the use and sale of pharmaceuticals, particularly narcotics, started about the same time. Patent medicines were common, and all that meant was that they were issued a letters patent by the Crown. We didn't have what we now call patent back then. They were over-the-counter prescriptions, sometimes called snake oil. The efficacy frequently depended more on the seller than its contents. because a lot of it did nothing. And that was when the government started stepping in and producing and passing their own consumer protection laws regarding medications. Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 said that certain drugs, including cannabis, had to be accurately labeled with their contents, and that was updated in 1938 to the Federal Pure Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, which is still in effect today. We call it the FDA Act. California passed a Poison Act in 1907 and amended it to include cannabis. 1914, New York State passed an act. Think about what was going on at the turn of the century from a historical standpoint, and all of the social upheaval, all of the things that happened between 1850 and 1950. A lot of factors, a lot of things going on. The United States immigrant population increased dramatically for a lot of reasons. Lots of wars, the Mexican Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, not a war, but there was a huge influx of immigrants from other countries to the United States. In fact, the first cannabis drug raid was in 1914 in LA, in Sonora Town. And the Great Depression in 1929 increased tensions, jobs were scarce, money was scarce, food was scarce. Also, Prohibition, 1920 to 1933. Started in 1919 with the Volstead Act, and it ended with the 21st Amendment in 1933. So for 13 years, alcohol was prohibited. It was highly unsuccessful from a governmental perspective. It increased crime. It solidified organized crime. The big thing it did was allowed the development of clandestine shipping routes all over the country and into Canada and Mexico. That's with the bootleggers, and which then now we have NASCAR. And it created an underground economy for alcohol. And that underground economy has continued. Speakeasies were popular. A lot of migration due to the Depression dispersed jazz music from New Orleans north to Chicago, New York, St. Louis, Kansas City, where it evolved into blues. Mostly black musicians were playing jazz. And they were, quote unquote, known for using cannabis. And so the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 was passed to try to control some of this narcotics trafficking by taxing narcotics. And basically, anybody who transported, sold, or possessed any kind of narcotics had to report it to the IRS and pay taxes on it. And that gave the government the ability to levy financial penalties for violations of the act, but it didn't give the states the authority to exercise their own police powers regarding seizing drugs or to punish those involved in the illicit trade. So the Narcotic Drug Import and Export Act of 1922, and there will not be a test on this. I just want you guys to, I swear to God there won't. There's a lot here, but I want you to have heard some of this and to know, you're thinking, why do I care? She's saying all this stuff, why do I care? You care because where we are today is based on all of this stuff, and the ability to project with any kind of accuracy where we're going tomorrow. If you don't understand how we got to where we are, I think it's very difficult to make an informed decision and to chart the correct course forward. So anyway, back to the boring part. I'll go fast. 1922, the Federal Narcotics Control Board was instituted, and it made drug possession a federal crime for the first time. And cannabis was classified as a narcotic and was outlawed under this act as well. 1930, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was established, and Congress abolished the FNCB in June of 1930, replaced it with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics under the Treasury Department. In July of 1930, President Hoover and the Treasury Secretary at the time, Andrew Mellon, appointed a gentleman by the name of Harry Anslinger to be the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And interestingly enough, he was Secretary Mellon's nephew. Coincidence? The USNDA of 1934 was then passed to replace inadequate and conflicting state laws. And actually, the big thing that the USNDA did was to really emphasize with the states that what powers the states had to regulate these substances and not just depend on the federal government. It coordinated enforcement through state and federal officers cooperating, which was the first time that had happened. Prohibited sales and transfers of any narcotics except under a state license, which again goes back to giving the power to the states to regulate. You can't possess, produce, or distribute any kind of narcotic drug without a specific license from the federal government and potentially your state government. It gave violations. You could revoke someone's medical license or revoke someone's license for violation of a state narcotic law. That was the first time that that could happen. And the big thing it did was it allowed anybody who obtained anything by fraud or deceit or altered a prescription, it provided the ability for the state or the federal government to prosecute those people as well. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 is where most of the time we start with the history of cannabis, and we're going to go pretty fast here. First national regulation of cannabis. After the FBN was formed in 1930, the use of cannabis and other drugs really became under increasing scrutiny, and especially after Prohibition was repealed, you had a lot of government agencies with nothing to do. That may or may not have had something to do with the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act and the FBN in the following year. The FBN produced a bunch of propaganda films. Anslinger said that cannabis use was increasing, that kids were smoking cannabis, that it made people induced violent crime, and it made people act irrationally and overly sexual. And the FBN produced a bunch of propaganda films, including Reefer Madness. And it ran an incredibly successful advertising campaign for the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. Prior to this, marijuana was slang. It was not included in official dictionaries. The medical profession didn't use it. In fact, the American Medical Association opposed the Marijuana Tax Act vehemently. And Dr. Charles Woodward authored a report and doubted their claims about addiction, violence, overdosage, said that because the Spanish word marijuana was unknown at the time to the medical profession, they didn't realize they were losing cannabis with this Marijuana Tax Act until right before it passed, and all of a sudden there was a panic that, wait, this is a medicine we need. What do you mean this is under this act? Marijuana is not the correct term, yet the burden of this bill is placed heavily on the doctors and pharmacists of this country. On October 1, 1937, the FBN and Denver police arrested 2 gentlemen for dealing in marijuana. That was the first conviction under federal law for not paying the marijuana tax that was levied under the 1937 Tax Act. One gentleman got 18 months and one gentleman got 4 years. The Tax Act wasn't real popular with everybody. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia of New York put together a group in 1938 to investigate the effects of smoking cannabis, and he commissioned the New York Academy of Medicine to prepare a report. They spent 5 years doing the research, and it contradicted all of the claims that the Treasury Department made about smoking cannabis. It's not a gateway drug. It's not physically addictive. It doesn't assist in criminal behavior. It doesn't cause juvenile delinquency. Anslinger was furious. He said it was unscientific. Apparently, he publicly denounced the academy, the physicians, everybody that was involved, and actually told researchers that they should not conduct any more experiments or studies on cannabis without his personal permission. And between 1944 and 45, he stopped all research that was being done on cannabis and its derivatives and commissioned the AMA to prepare a report that would disprove the LaGuardia report. And it leveraged again on racism. We're going to see that this is a continuing issue with cannabis prohibition and cannabis regulation. In 1972, the Schaefer Commission finally admitted that all of the stories were false and that there was no confirmation in 1930, and there's still no confirmation in 1972, but here we are. By the mid to end of late 30s, cannabis was regulated as a drug in every state. 5 years after the LaGuardia Commission's report, the AMA no longer supported it as a medicine, and it was removed from the United States Pharmacopoeia and was no longer available to be used as medicine. Leary versus the United States is a seminal case. The Tax Act was overturned by this case and was replaced by Congress in 1970 with the Controlled Substances Act. In Leary, Dr. Timothy Leary from Harvard was arrested for crossing the border. Actually, he crossed the border from the United States to Mexico, was denied entry into Mexico, and got busted on his way back across the bridge with cannabis that he actually brought from New York and took in, so New York and Texas and crossing, and he said he was charged with violating this Tax Act and not paying the taxes and having a tax stamp. And he said that I'm not a physician. I'm not in a position where I qualify as somebody who can deal in cannabis or any other opiates or opioids. If I applied for a tax act, or if I applied for the stamp, I would have to incriminate myself and say that I'm a user of cannabis, and I'm a purchaser of cannabis, and I'm a seller of cannabis. And by virtue of him having to disclose that in order to apply for the tax stamp, he would be incriminating himself, and he said, that's a violation of the Fifth Amendment. And the court agreed and said, yeah, we can't make you incriminate yourself. Again, that pesky Constitution and that penumbra of rights. So Congress said, watch this, and replied a year later with the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, under which cannabis was officially outlawed for any use, including medical. And you know the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act better as the CSA. It was enacted allegedly to protect the public from, protect the health and general welfare of the American people. Title II of that act is the Controlled Substances Act. And that's what created 5 schedules of controlled substances based on currently accepted medical use, relative abuse potential, and their likelihood of causing dependence when that substance is abused. During the drafting of this, it was suggested that marijuana be temporarily put on Schedule I pending the Commission's report. And guess where it still is? Schedule I indicates that it has no accepted medical value and presents a high potential for abuse and dependence. Racism and bias played a huge role in the politics of the Nixon administration. Most of you are way too young to remember that, but when he commissioned that act and the Controlled Substances Act, he also, in 1970, he appointed a commission on the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse called the Schaefer Commission, and because it was chaired by former Pennsylvania Governor Schaefer. And on March 22 of 72, he presented a 224-page report that is actually published in a paperback by Signet Books, if anybody wants to read it, called Marijuana, A Signal of Misunderstanding. And the report called for a policy which prohibited commercial distribution, but it did not apply criminal sanctions to private possession or use, nor casual nonprofit distribution incidental to use. That phrasing was soon called or referred to, and we still talk about it, as decriminalization. The report said that while public sentiment tended to view marijuana users as dangerous, they found them to be timid, drowsy, and passive. And this is an excellent quote. I'll let you read it. No information that it did any of the things that we thought it did, that it was alleged to have done. Relative potential for harm to the vast majority of users and its actual impact on society does not justify a social policy designed to seek out and punish those who use it. In 1972, the National Commission recommended that all criminal penalties for private use and possession be eliminated. And we obviously know that that didn't happen. There is an article that Dan Baum is a reporter for Harper's Magazine. In 1994, he interviewed John Ehrlichman, who was the assistant to President Nixon for domestic affairs. He interviewed Ehrlichman about the CSA and that process and what was going on at that time. I'll let you read that quote because I find it so offensive, I find it difficult to read aloud. Can you see it? You have no slides. Have you not had slides in a while? Okay, I'll send you, okay. I wonder why we don't have slides. I'm going to read that to you because y'all don't have it. And you want to know what this war on drugs was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Important cases. You guys don't have slides, and I don't know what to do about that, so I'm just going to wing it. U.S. versus Oakland Cannabis Buyers Cooperative in 2001. California passed Prop 215 in 1996, and OCBC was a patient co-op that formed, and they said that the CSA's prohibitions as applied to the intrastate manufacture and possession exceeded Congress's authority under the Commerce Clause. And the Supreme Court said, nope, federal anti-drug laws do not permit an exception for medical cannabis. And I'm sorry? Oh, I was just using it for the slide. I was just using it. Oh, yeah, and the second one you need to be familiar with, Gonzalez versus Rake. That was another Commerce Clause case where the Supreme Court said that the Commerce Clause allows the federal government to regulate cannabis. There was some significant dissent on that case, and that dissent is actually still quoted fairly regularly. Justice Thomas said, if the majority is to be taken seriously in this case, the federal government may now regulate quilting bees, clothes drives, and potluck suppers throughout the 50 states. This makes a mockery of Madison's assurance to the people of New York that the powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined, while those of the states are numerous and indefinite. We're still stuck with this. So in response, Congress came up with the Rohrabacher-Farr or Rohrabacher-Blumenauer Amendment. Initially, Senator Rohrabacher and another senator proposed it, and whoever ends up going off Congress and then whoever sponsors it next gets their name tacked onto the end. So right now it's the Hawley Rohrabacher-Farr Blumenauer Amendment. Passed in 2014, Section 538 is a section that we care about because it prohibits the Justice Department from spending money to interfere with the implementation of state cannabis laws. And that was an addendum to the budget, the federal budget. It has to be renewed every year in order to be in effect. It's been renewed every year, but it does not change the legal status of cannabis. It just says that the federal government will not spend our money to interfere with the implementation of what the states are doing, unless. And the Ogden and Cole memoranda, there was an Ogden memo in 2009 and 3 Cole memos, 2011, 13, and 14. Basically, those were advisory memos from the Justice Department that said it's not an efficient use of federal resources for us to focus on individuals, or people with cancer, but we're not gonna, that is not permission. And if you're not following your state laws, you're gonna get in trouble. And that is what has happened. The last case that came down in January of 22, First Circuit case, there was United States versus Bilodeau. These two gentlemen said they were state-sanctioned, state-licensed caregivers, and they shouldn't be sued or prosecuted because they were state compliant. And the state that they were in, Maine, allowed two legal caregivers. You could have 6 plants per caregiver, or 6 plants apiece. They had 895. And the court said, yeah. Congress surely did not intend for the amendment to provide a safe harbor to those with facially valid documents without regard for blatantly illegitimate activity. So just because you say I'm following state law, strict compliance is what they ask for. The conundrum here is we're all in a difficult position to provide patients with medical cannabis. Physicians risk violating federal law and losing their DEA license. It's still a Schedule I drug. It's illegal to prescribe. Prescribing it theoretically is aiding and abetting the acquisition of marijuana. Physicians can write a recommendation under a state program if patients fall under one of the state enumerated conditions, but you still can't prescribe. And even as nurses and nurse practitioners, the same rules apply. A state card basically is it's an affirmative defense against state prosecution, but it doesn't provide you any kind of a shield against violations of federal law. Issues in practice. Biggest barriers to adoption of medical cannabis, according to a 2019 survey of physicians, lack of clinical trials. But as Dr. Sulak pointed out, there's a ton of research. I looked this morning on clinicaltrials.gov. There were 1,319 open clinical trials involving cannabis as of about 9 o'clock this morning. A lot of physicians are worried about legal exposure, the risk of malpractice, which is pretty theoretical at this point. Lack of guidance from professional associations or colleagues, concern that their patients will be punished somehow by their employers, and the big one, in my opinion, is the professional and social stigma of being known as a medical cannabis provider. And we're all fighting those to this day. The big case that everyone in the medical field needs to be aware of is Conant versus Walters. It was a 2002 case, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is California, said that a physician's discussion of the potential benefits of medical cannabis and making those recommendations constitute protected speech under the First Amendment. Conant Court stated doctors should not be held liable for conduct that patients might engage in after leaving the office, and that open and unrestricted communication is vital to preserve the patient-doctor relationship and to ensure that the patients get proper treatment. To date, no court in the United States has considered potential malpractice liability for a physician or a nurse certifying or recommending medical cannabis. So, not that it can't happen, it hasn't yet. And employment and cannabis use, there really aren't any protections for employment. There are states that are starting to enact some protections, but employers are finding a way around that. So there really aren't a lot of protections for using cannabis for our patients yet. The Americans with Disabilities Act, people have tried, there was a case that they tried to bring that under the ADA, and that won't fly because the anti-discrimination and employment statutes are predicated on discrimination based on lawful activity, and the use of cannabis is not lawful, so you get no ADA protection. The Controlled Substances Act so far has been a pretty insurmountable obstacle to these cases so far. So how do conscientious healthcare providers limit their legal liability? Look to your practice associations. Look for practice guidelines. Provider practice acts, they're not checklists for practice, but they protect the public from unsafe practitioners. Federation of State Medical Boards, April 2016, and again, I'll send you guys these slides because they're really good. I'm kind of bummed. They're not nearly as good as Dr. Sulak's. FSMB, April 2016, 9 things. Basically, make sure that you got a relationship with your patient. Develop a plan, verify qualifying conditions, monitor the patient, and adapt as necessary. Be aware of substance abuse history and mental health disorders. Maintain accurate records. Common sense things. NCBSN did National Nursing Guidelines for Medical Cannabis, the same thing. Nurse shall have a working knowledge of the current state of legalization of medical and rec cannabis use, working knowledge of the jurisdiction's laws, not understanding of the endocannabinoid system. There are some practice guidelines for professionals. Patient considerations. We have a responsibility as healthcare providers to understand medical cannabis therapy. It's no different than any other medication. Your administrations should have policies and procedures regarding cannabis, because people are going to use it, even though it's federally illegal. We know this. And as providers, we can't stick our heads in the sand and go, oh, well, it's federally illegal, so we're not going to talk about it. Your patients are using it. Our patients are using it. We need to know about it. We need to know what it does. We need to know why they're using it. We have a responsibility as healthcare providers to help them with that. That's what we do. Know your professional position papers, if there are any, and the guidelines for practice. You can't enter cannabis as a medication on most EMRs because it's not on the list of drugs. You have to enter it manually, which prohibits it from being cross-checked with other medications in your EMR. So, you know, that's another area to work for. If you work in tech, if you work in, we need these things. Huge patient teaching. Remember that you can talk to your patients about cannabis, and it's up to us to help change attitudes about cannabis. Teach your patients how to talk to other healthcare providers about cannabis. We teach that if a patient comes in and they disclose cannabis use, it usually happens when you're asking them about illicit or illegal drugs. If they have a card, we suggest that the provider redirect them and say, if you're using this medically, you need to list this as a medication. It's not an illicit drug for you, it's a medication. And you need to list it as such, and you need to be able to tell your provider how you're using it, and when you're using it, and why you're using it, and what you're using, so that they can incorporate that into your care plan. And it's up to us as providers to give them permission to do that and to teach them how. No judgment. Watch for judgment and prejudice, unconscious bias. Let your patients know that you're accepting of their use. And we know that this medication works. We know that patients have incredibly positive results from the use of cannabis. We see less dependence on opiates, less dependence on other medications. We see them healing their endocannabinoid system, returning to health, returning to homeostasis. As healthcare providers, it's up to us to help teach them about cannabis and to know about cannabis and to make sure that they understand that we're okay with it and that they can come to us and share that with us and that it's important. That's pretty much it. And I will be happy to send the slides out.
Okay, just a few notes about timing. At each phase of this, we have so much to tell you. Everybody's running 5 minutes over. So it's now 3:45. If we can be back here in 10 minutes, I will ask the faculty if they want to stay till 5:15, so we'll still have, 15 minutes for questions and answers. But we really should try to get back in 10 minutes to do the last part of today, and then we'll end at 5:15 instead of 5. Okay. Really? Hey, thank you. Okay, please take your seats. Ready for more brain food? As it turns out, this pre-conference is actually highly technical, and those that are registered for this are supposed to get a copy of the slides as well with the references. So, and we'll have our Q&A at the end. So hopefully we can get all this great information in. So my job is to teach you how some of this basic science and legal background can be applied clinically. Just 2 seconds about myself. I supervised a group of cannabis clinics in California that saw 300,000 patients. And we did a demographic study, and we compiled a lot of data about how people were using medical cannabis. And a lot of that is given to you in a book that I've written that's also came out this year, and Medical Cannabis, Pearls for Clinical Practice, and I believe, I'm not sure, Dr. Sulak may know more about this. We're going to have a book signing at some point this weekend with his book and my book, both excellent medical reference texts for you. So we will begin. So what do we need to know to be a cannabis clinical specialist? And in many states, these are MDs and DOs. In some states, there are family nurse practitioners and physician assistants or pharmacists that are legally designated as the gatekeepers to know about how to provide cannabis medically and legally. So, little aside, on my feedback from the CME approval accreditation people, they didn't like this slide. And they said, what do you need that for? It's not about cannabis. But we're trying to learn what's important in understanding how to recommend cannabis as a clinician. And these particular skills that I've listed here are all really essential, so I want to review them. You do need to know how to evaluate medical history documents and extract the information from them about which medical conditions you're treating. It's not enough for the patient to come in and say, I have a problem sleeping, because the patient may not realize that their rheumatoid arthritis or their depression or multiple other conditions that they have are also appropriate for cannabis treatment. So you need to determine that, what their conditions are. For legally, also you have to do an appropriate exam for the diagnosis. That's the history and the physical. Specifically for cannabis, because it has been shrouded with some secrecy and some doubt and has a stigma, it's important to put patients at ease and counsel them about the medical benefits. Very often, you're the first person that is in a position to help the patient understand how to use a substance that they've been using recreationally as a medicine. It's one of the most important skills that we have to do. If you don't document it, legally it didn't happen. So you have to document everything that you talked about, the advice and consent, the informed consent, the risks and the benefits, why you're using cannabis, what treatments that you're, what conditions you're treating. Most states, as part of that Federation of State Medical Boards, also ask you to put in a treatment plan and referral sources for ongoing care. And then, of course, what we're going to learn about today, expertise in the clinical use of medical cannabis for a multitude of conditions. So moving on to expertise in clinical cannabis, there's a lot to know. And unfortunately, in the history of cannabis healthcare practitioners who sign the recommendation paper, they don't know this stuff. So it's really important moving forward as we hone our skills for the cannabis clinician specialist to know what we did earlier, the basic science of cannabis chemistry, the endocannabinoid system, cannabinoids, terpenes, other components of the plant. We also need to know the effect of cannabis on body physiology, organs, and systems. One particular interest of mine is understanding that cannabis sativa is an herbal botanical product. It's not a pharmaceutical medicine. And when you dose it and you discuss, delivery and follow-up, you have to learn a little bit about how to do herbal prescription versus pharmaceutical prescription. And that's not something that is taught in medical training, but we do teach it in cannabis training. For your state, you need to know which medical conditions qualify. You need to know your laws. And after all that, you need to know what works with dosing, and that is very individualized, and each patient is different, and Dr. Sulak's actually going to talk about that during the conference. I have put in here also, for me as a practitioner, the effect of cannabis consumption at chronic versus naive or acute dosage is completely different, completely. So you need to know both ends of the spectrum. What is your naive patient going to experience, and what is your chronic consumption patient going to experience? Which brings us to the issue of tolerance, overuse, and knowing about dependence and the cannabis withdrawal syndrome. And there's always lots of sources to learn from. There's many good CMEs available online. There's this conference, and I encourage you all to try to learn what you need to learn to cover this page. Because we're in Missouri, I have listed exactly from the internet what patients need for a Missouri certification. I don't think that I will stick with this and move on because each state is different. But there, as Cynthia said, there is a Federation of State Medical Board guidelines that's supposed to guide all states that have what you need to know and how to do an appropriate certification. So the qualifying conditions, for example, in Missouri, they're different for each state, are these listed here. I want to point out, because it's important in the next slide, that it's down like third bullet point from the bottom. A chronic medical condition that is normally treated with a prescription medication that could lead to physical or psychological dependence. They're talking about the medication, and that cannabis in that case might serve as a safer alternative. That's the entire area of harm reduction, that cannabis replaces prescription medications, drugs of abuse, alcohol, tobacco, in a much safer way, and that's what we do a lot in our work. And then there's many other conditions here. I want to move on to, okay, in a minute, I'll move on to the 10 most common conditions that we see nationally. But moving on with Missouri, we see that the highest percentage of patients in Missouri, 30%, use cannabis to treat this physical or psychological dependence. And I had to really look that up because I said, are they talking about cannabis dependence here? No, they're talking about harm reduction. Then chronic medical conditions, 28%, psychiatric, 17%, migraine, 6%, terminal illnesses, 3%, and all the other conditions, 16%. So if we go back and we look at this whole long list, we see that it's the chronic medical conditions and their treatment in standard medicine that actually cover most of what cannabis is used for in this state and in most states. Oh, age. So Missouri is not necessarily the standard for the whole country, but we see that the majority of patients in Missouri are between age 30 and 50. Some states, the younger population, 18 to 29, have a higher precedence, higher numbers. We also see that minors under 17 is only 0.31%. In some states, it could be up to about 5%. So it depends on how familiar the physicians are that are recommending this product with working with different age populations. And that's what my talk's going to be about in a couple of days, working with different age populations. The more familiar that a clinician specialist becomes with working with different age populations, the more comfortable they are recommending cannabis for that group. And we do see that elderly people, seniors and above, are here 22% of the population. And that's another interesting statistic, that the use of cannabis by seniors, especially since CBD became more widely available, has been rising as the fastest growing group. Okay, so statistically, pain and chronic pain is the highest percentage of usage of medical cannabis anywhere in the country, in all states. Then, depending upon what is approved, insomnia generally comes next. Some states do not approve insomnia, such as Missouri. So we don't see statistically that number is recorded, but in most states that do approve insomnia, that's the next one. Then we see mental health, depression, anxiety. I added PTSD at the end, but in states that approve it as a specific condition, it could be very high. For example, in my state of New Mexico at the moment, PTSD is the highest mental illness category because they don't approve depression and anxiety. So you have to be really creative if you're a physician in how you diagnose your patients so that they can qualify. Following the mood disorders, pain, and insomnia, then we find muscle spasm. In some states where that's specifically a diagnosis, it's very high. Then headache, migraine, nausea, cancer, and anorexia, and included in all that are the side effects of many chronic conditions. You know, anorexia and nausea and pain are part of most debilitating chronic conditions. So we really need to know how cannabis works with those conditions. Okay, so we're going to go through those conditions, and I'm giving you a lot of information here. You'll get a copy of the slides, and because I wrote this book, I've got all these references, so there's a lot of technical stuff, but I'll summarize it. So in the states that have been surveyed, 72 to 90% of cannabis patients list pain as a qualifying condition. It's very high. In some of the studies that specify what's the most common type of pain, like in this group of clinics back in 2006 when we did our survey, low back pain was the most common pain. I have to qualify that and say that, you know, back in those days, almost everybody's got a bad back at some point in their life. So people would come in wanting to get, you know, approved for cannabis, and that's a really common condition that they decided, you know, that's what they're going to use. I don't know that low back pain is the most common pain overall, but it was at that time. Okay, so we learned a lot about endocannabinoids and what cannabis can and cannot do for pain, but I want to elaborate. Earlier, we learned that. So pain isn't pain until it reaches the brain. Prior to that, it's nociception. We already learned that THC and endocannabinoids are anti-nociceptive, so it decreases the pain signal from being interpreted in the brain as pain. That's one thing. When it gets to the brain, it also decreases that interpretation as well. Very important. But THC does that. CBD does not. They have very different effects and actions on pain. Both THC and CBD inhibit neurotoxicity and are neuroprotective and are antioxidants. So both of them do all those three things, making cannabis overall most effective for neuropathic pain and inflammatory pain. They're both anti-inflammatory as well. It's not on the slide. So in that case, both of those will inhibit neuropathic and inflammatory pain. But THC is the only one that changes the perception of the pain. Okay. THC has been shown to be analgesic, whereas CBD has been shown to be anti-hyperanalalgesic. They're not the same. So for instance, CBD does not interact with opiates to decrease, to magnify analgesia. THC does that, CBD doesn't. Because CBD is analgesic, CBD is not. So overall, THC and CBD, effective for neuropathic and inflammatory pain. THC, effective for changing the perception of pain. Then we move on to chronic pain. This is where the mood effects of cannabis become so important. And almost all the studies on chronic pain show that cannabis-derived extracts are consistently referred to as improving the patient's quality of life. So typically, like in some of the studies done with multiple sclerosis pain, the pain scale only went down to a 7 on a scale of 10. That's only a 30% reduction in pain. But things like improved quality of life and improved sleep and improved mood, improved appetite, that's where you see a lot of the benefits of cannabis for chronic pain patients. Chronic pain is complex, and cannabis manages the pain in part by preventing peripheral nociception from reaching the brain, and when it does, it changes the perception. So overall, THC has been shown to be most effective for chronic versus acute pain because of these side benefits. CBD, everybody's trying to sell CBD as effective for pain. It's actually not as good as THC, but in fact, the mix, the THC-CBD mix, is really good. It's better than either one. So there's a lot of CBD out there that actually comes from hemp that has no THC with it, and that has, or very little, that has, sometimes it's extracted without a full spectrum extract. It doesn't have the terpenes. That's not nearly as effective for pain. If you're going to go buy some hemp CBD and expect it to take care of your pain, you're not likely to get as good a result as when you use a cannabis extract. This happens because a product of the synergy between all the different cannabinoids, the cannabinoid acids, the CBD, the THC, and the terpenes. Beta-caryophyllene is a primary terpene that is also anti-inflammatory, and it actually acts on CB1 receptors. So full spectrum extract is the way to go. Okay. Let me just back up for a minute. It's not my intention to give specific dosing and specific guidelines for how much you should use for what. These are generalized introductory comments. There will be more talks, clinical talks during the conference that might go into more specifics of what to use, how much to use. But I do want to emphasize that with chronic pain, you're going to use chronic doses of cannabis, and that amount is probably going to be a lot higher than someone that uses cannabis for acute pain on a very rarefied basis. A lot less will be effective in that case, whereas when you develop a tolerance, you're going to need higher doses. Okay, so in some studies, up to 71% of medical cannabis patients listed insomnia as their qualifying condition in those states where you could do that. And most of them, if they did list pain, also listed insomnia, because insomnia is a byproduct of chronic pain. So we have to treat sleep. Okay, it's complex. The effects of CBD and THC on sleep and which dose you use gives you the full spectrum of effects, from sedating to alerting to more sleep to less sleep to how long the effects will last. Can you take it every night? What happens if you take it every night? What happens to your overall sleep in the long term? It's really complex. I'm going to give you a few pointers here. THC, not cannabis, but THC itself causes a decrease in REM sleep at low doses. That's what makes it so useful for PTSD, because it'll decrease nightmares, which happen in REM sleep. So that's a property of THC itself. And it increases deep sleep or slow wave sleep as well. These effects will diminish with tolerance. So many chronic cannabis users who use cannabis for sleep will find that it helps at the beginning, but not so much long term. One of the strategies that I used clinically was to keep THC at a lower dose, not use it every night to develop tolerance, use other herbal products like one night cannabis, one night valerian, let's say, and then, with some people with really bad sleep, one night their sleeping medicine. So instead of taking a sleeping pill every night, they're only taking it 2 to 3 times a week, which decreased their dependence on the sleeping medicine, and while not developing a tolerance to cannabis at the same time. As far as CBD, that's really good for anxious sleep. So if you're anxious before you get to sleep and you can't go to sleep because you're worried, that's where CBD comes in. But the dosage matters too. So very low doses of CBD, very low, it's not here, very low doses are not going to affect your sleep and may be anxiolytic. Moderate doses, I have to change this, may contribute to actual wakefulness. Whereas very high doses, such as in the kids that take 200 milligrams or something for epilepsy, they actually have a sedating effect. And somnolence is one of the side effects of very high doses of CBD. Wakefulness, moderate doses. Anti-anxiety, low doses. So this is an experiment that's very instructive. These were healthy volunteers, so we're not talking about people with tolerance. And this is just acute use. People without a tolerance to cannabis, they were given, not even cannabis, they were given THC and CBD. And 15 milligrams of THC increased the duration of slow wave sleep or deep sleep. Great. When they added CBD at low doses, 5 milligrams and 5 milligrams, there was a decrease in slow wave sleep, indicating that the CBD was somehow contributing what they called to wakefulness. Then at the highest doses, 15 milligrams of THC plus 15 milligrams of CBD, the wakefulness was increased, suggesting that in that range from 5 to 15 milligrams of CBD, you could actually be impairing sleep. But that's naive patients. So that's just to show you that, everything you do with cannabis is all about a homeostatic regulatory system, and you have to find that right, sweet spot for every individual. So a 1-to-1 mix is really good. And that's Sativex, which was that nabiximols that Dr. Sulak was talking about. And they also found that increased sleep quality. People felt rested the next day. Whereas sometimes when they just use THC, as in the slide before, they were feeling groggy the next day and not as well rested. Even though they slept, they didn't feel as well rested. So this mix is really good for a good quality of sleep. Now, one of the things that happened in clinical practice is that people would smoke pot before they went to sleep, and they'd fall asleep great, and wake up in the middle of the night because they smoked, which lasts 2 to 6 hours of effect. So if you want to use cannabis to treat insomnia, it's best to use a longer-acting form, such as tinctures, capsules, edibles. Tinctures are my preference because they last from about 4 to 8 hours. Some edibles last more than 10 hours in some people, so you can really wake up groggy till noon the next day. And, you know, the strategy that I did not like, which most uneducated patients do, is they'll smoke before they go to sleep, and then they'll wake up in the middle of the night and smoke again. So at most, they're usually only getting 4 hours of sleep, and we want to get, you know, 4 hours of uninterrupted sleep at least. 6 is better. Okay. The last thing about sleep is that the most important thing to get good sleep is not the THC or CBD. The most important thing is the type of cultivar. It turns out that so-called indica strains, which is not used scientifically anymore, but the terpene profile, the strains that have a high amount of myrcene, which is a body relaxant and a sedative, are most effective for producing good sleep. Okay, now we're moving on to depression. And again, in some studies, we see that up to 50% of medical cannabis patients list depression as a qualifying condition. And I love this cartoon, I put it in. How do you feel the new antidepressant combo is working? I'll tell you, doc, I got a splitting headache, my tongue feels like dry leather, I can't hold anything down, I'm anxious, restless, and I lost my sex drive. Oh, good, it's working. And this is a prime example of harm reduction, because while they like to say that cannabis produces poor quality of sleep, or you might feel groggy the next day, which we can handle by dosage and delivery, it doesn't do all this stuff. So it's kind of a lot better than prescription medication. Okay. Well, there are many, 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 many studies that tried to link cannabis to a cause for depression. And these were done like in the 70s and the 80s. They used unspecified strains of cannabis with recreational users. And indeed, there are many strains of cannabis that can induce lethargy. And therefore, they can contribute to the symptoms of depression. So using the right cultivar is really important. Nevertheless, they were poorly designed studies. They didn't correct for confounding factors, and there are several studies that followed that show that long-term use of cannabis does not lead to an increase in depression. There are some studies that show that long-term use of cannabis lead to a decreased use of depression. And this very same accrediting society suggested that I include those studies, so in the updated slide deck, you'll get them in your references. The endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome that Dr. Sulak was talking about has also been implicated in depression. And there's a hypothesis that depressed patients have reduced levels of endocannabinoids. I mean, there's so many different causes for depression, but in some patients that are depressed, there are reduced levels of endocannabinoids. We also see that in fibromyalgia. We see it sometimes in migraine patients. So one of the ways that THC is really important for depression, not CBD, but THC, is that it primes the endocannabinoid system and gives it a boost. So they found that, as in most CBD1 dependent reactions, there is a biphasic dose. So what that means is that a biphasic curve related to dose. What that means is that low amounts of THC will have one effect, middle amounts will have another effect, and high amounts will have the opposite effect to the first one. So the dose with THC and depression has been found to be biphasic. So of course, there's conflicting studies because nobody measured the dose. So at low doses, you see antidepressant behavior, whereas in really high doses, you see the opposite effect. So again, every time you look at any study that's written about cannabis and any symptom, you have to remember that most cannabinoids act in a biphasic fashion, and the dosage and the chronicity is imperative to understand what the effects are going to be. They could be polar opposites. Okay. They did try to say that CBD has antidepressant effects, but look how high the animal studies had to go to find antidepressant effects. 50 milligrams per kilogram. In general, when someone, in my clinical experience, when someone says that CBD is helping their depression, they have anxious depression. It's really helping their anxiety. Because these kind of doses, I mean, the average dose of CBD that we use clinically might be 1 milligram per kilogram. So there's no way we're getting up to these doses. So CBD is not generally considered to be an antidepressant. But remember those pesky terpenes. If you have a cultivar that has a nice balanced mix of THC and CBD, and it has a very citrusy aroma that might be coming from the terpene limonene, the limonene is antidepressant. That's been proven action of limonene. So the strain that a person uses and the dosage is going to determine whether it's going to be an effective antidepressant. For example, a strain with myrcene, which I told you is sedating, you know, that might make a person feel like inertia, and they might call that depression. Okay. So we're moving on to anxiety. And again, it's really high up there, up to 58% listed as a qualifying condition. So starting with THC, there's very many conflicting reports about the effect of cannabis that's rich in THC on anxiety. Indeed, it's pretty well proven now that at low doses, any stimulation of the CB1 receptor is anxiolytic, anti-anxiety, including the effects of THC, whereas at higher doses, it's anxiogenic. So that's where you get THC causes paranoia. Well, that is definitely an exacerbation of anxiety. In general, clinically, I don't tend to go towards the higher THC cultivars for anxiety, but we do rely on CBD a lot for that because it's definitely antipsychotic and anti-anxiety at most doses, so that are clinically used. So you're going to look a lot towards CBD for anti-anxiety. If you do use THC, there's THC plus the terpene linalool, which smells like lavender. Linalool itself is anti-anxiety. If anybody's ever smelt essential oil of, lavender, you just feel immediate ease. So you can use low doses of a THC-rich cultivar as long as there's linalool there, and that will be anti-anxiety. So they have done studies with CBD to see whether it has a bidirectional curve, the same as THC does. Unfortunately, the doses that these studies were done are not doses that we use clinically. One study started at 100 milligrams. Another study that I didn't even mention here started at 300 milligrams. So, if you do 100, 300, 900, you'll see that the 100 works. The middle one, the 300 doesn't work. And then the 900 works. Well, we already said that if you increase CBD to really high doses, you're going to see somnolence. And so, but clinically speaking, most of the doses of CBD we use are in the lower end of this, and you don't have to worry about dosage so much with CBD. They also found that CBD can counteract the anxiogenic effect of THC. So if you have a patient that is, dyed in the wool wanting to use THC for their anxiety, make sure that there's some CBD there. Okay. I have found that 10 to 18% list muscle spasm as a qualifying condition in the literature, but in clinical work, it's a lot higher. A lot of people have pulled muscles. A lot of people use cannabis topically to immediately alleviate a tight muscle. They don't necessarily go to a cannabis clinician and say, I want to use cannabis because I pulled my muscle playing football. But it's a really common use of cannabis. Both THC and CBD are muscle relaxant. So they do work by different mechanisms, so using both of them is really useful because you're targeting a multitude of receptors and you're not getting to saturation with either one. So if you want to treat muscle spasm, use both CBD and THC. And contrary to what you would expect, since it's so widely used clinically, there are very, 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 very few studies on muscle spasm and cannabis. As a matter of fact, I can honestly say that I really didn't find any for just regular muscle spasms. There was one in a paraplegic. There was one in a, secondary to chemotherapy. But this is an area that's highly understudied, and it should really be researched. Now, in contrast to muscle spasm, there is a lot of information about cannabis and spasticity that actually is a neurologic symptom rather than a muscle contractility symptom. So there's a different mechanism. Most of these studies were done with multiple sclerosis patients who had muscle spasm. MUSIC trial, multiple sclerosis extract of cannabis trial in 2012, they found really strong rate of relief from muscle stiffness, 30%, twice as much as placebo. So cannabis is really good for spasticity. Unfortunately, you can't use it topically that effectively for spasticity because you have to get into the central nervous system. So you have to take it internally. And I have found that with my multiple sclerosis patients, that if they want to reduce their baclofen usage, you have to take cannabis internally. And other than that, topical's the way to go. Okay. Now we get to a specific kind of pain. Most of the information that's available for cannabis is available for migraine. It's been classically used for migraine for centuries. It's listed in all the old 1800s and the old pharmacopoeias as to treat migraine, well known. Now, why is that? Well, headaches involve overactivation of the trigeminal vascular pathway, which is under endocannabinoid regulation. So we're not just dealing with pain, we're dealing with head pain. And as I said, endocannabinoids are intimately involved with that, and clinical endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome has been suggested as existing in migraine patients. And some studies have actually shown that in the brain of migraine patients, there are lower levels of circulating endocannabinoids. Not all. It depends on the chronicity of the migraine and where in the process that you're doing this measurement. Because migraine's a complex mechanism where there's an initial phase that involves vasodilation. Initial phase that involves vasoconstriction, and then a rebound phase that involves vasodilation. Now we know that THC is a vasodilator. So if you use it at the start of the migraine, when you're in the first phase, then you're going to be really successful. If you use it when your head's already throbbing and dilated, you may get pain relief because cannabis still will treat the pain, but you don't actually get a reversal of the migraine. So patients report that if cannabis is taken at the onset of the headache goes away, and that's actually really a true thing. I mean, clinically, I saw that about 90% of the time. So I typically recommend that patients carry around a little vape pen that's high in THC. We're talking about THC cannabis here. And, you know, if they feel a migraine coming on, just have a few puffs of that and it will reverse. Most of the time, that's true. There's another kind of headache that we should talk about, tension headaches. They can lead to a migraine. So if you feel any tension coming on in your temples or back of your neck, then you can immediately apply topical THC-rich cannabis, and it will mitigate the onset of the headache. Okay, so now we are going to talk about nausea. And nausea being under the regulation of the autonomic nervous system is one of those conditions that the dose and chronicity of cannabis use is, again, imperative. Over many of the dosages of cannabis, you will see antiemetic effects. You will see them with CBD, you'll see them with THC, you'll see it with CBD acid, you'll see it with CBG. So pretty much any cannabis is going to be really good for nausea, but we'll see before we're done here that if you take it repeatedly, you may get a paradoxical effect. So THC in the form of dronabinol was one of the first indications for a federally approved cannabinoid for the treatment of nausea. It's been approved since 1985 for chemotherapy-associated nausea and vomiting. And after that, following that, it was approved for HIV nausea. And so it's well known, THC is good for nausea. CBD came along later on, and hey, we found out that CBD is really good for nausea too, but it's thought to happen by a different mechanism. And again, we see the biphasic effect here. Even with CBD at higher doses, it can induce vomiting in animal studies. So one really good strategy here again is to use a mix, a CBD THC 1-to-1 mix for nausea, for vomiting, because they're both active. And then you don't build a tolerance to either one. And this is really important when we get to the paradoxical effect. So I do recommend a mix. Or if you can get CBDA, that's another good thing to mix with your CBD or THC. They all bind to different receptors. Okay. This loss of homeostasis by overusing an endocannabinoid regulator is a real problem with cannabis. And like if you use it for sleep and then after a while it stops working. If you use it for nausea and after a while it stops working, the next slide will show you what that might look like. So it's really important to use these strategies of mixing your cannabinoids and mixing chronicity so that you don't get in that category of using too much for too long and disrupt your own endocannabinoid system. Before we get to that, just to review. So if you're throwing up, obviously you're not going to be able to take your cannabis by swallowing it. Sometimes you can take a sublingual tincture and just spray it into the mouth. You can get an atomizer if you can't find a spray in a dispensary, but that's, you know, comes on in 5 minutes. So that's one good way. You can smoke it, you can vaporize it, and there are some rectal preparations that, you know, similar to composine suppositories, you know, that you can use for really strong cases where you need to get a lot in really fast. Okay, so what is the paradoxical effect of cannabinoids on nausea and vomiting? It's actually been given a name, cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. Most of the literature says that we don't really know what causes it except for chronic high use of THC-rich cannabis. But I don't know why they say they don't understand what causes it, because chronic high use of THC-rich cannabis is going to cause an endocannabinoid dysfunction. And so you get the opposite effect as you do in most biphasic reactions, where a low dose produces one response, the high dose produces the exact opposite response. So cannabinoid hyperemesis patients were found to use cannabis daily for at least 10 years. And they get into a paroxysm of vomiting that does not stop for days to a week. And there's only 2 treatments that they found useful so far, and that's to stand under a hot shower and let the hot water hit your chest wall. And I mean, patients with this syndrome actually stand under the hot shower a lot. It's a real thing, like every day, like 10 times a day. And they're also advised to cut cannabis out completely. I have a family member that experienced this, and I finally got him to get off cannabis. 3 or 4 years later, he thought, oh, I'm safe now. And then it started to happen again. So I am a holistically oriented practitioner and quite intuitive, and I examined him when he was, in one of these states. And it's interesting. This shows you personal variability. He's kind of like a type A and always really busy, and his heart was going fast, and he was kind of leaning forward like this, and his heart was beating against his chest wall, and he was really stressed. Of course, he's vomiting for hours. Of course, you're going to be really stressed. But I actually felt like his whole adrenal axis was thrown off as well, and he was experiencing medical chronic stress along with the vomiting. So I would think that if you find anti-stress mechanisms, they're actually going to reduce the duration of this cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome as well. Okay, so cancer. I am putting this in here as a qualifying condition that you should know what to do and what not to do. Most of the patients that want to use cannabis in the condition of cancer use it to want to treat the symptoms of the cancer or cancer therapies. So it's actually a supportive treatment for symptoms, not for the cancer itself. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But the symptoms they're treating, nausea, vomiting, loss of appetite, poor mood, poor sleep, neuropathy from chemotherapy or radiation. It generally just lifts their mood, decreases pain, increases their food intake, and it's a really, really, really good thing to use to treat these symptoms. There's actually nothing else you can take that's going to do all those things. And you're talking about using typical clinical doses, which are not high, to treat those symptoms. And depending upon what it is, you can use a mix of CBD and THC. Depends on the mood. We already discussed that. Depends on the type of sleep. Depends upon the level of neuropathy. We're going to get to appetite in a minute. That requires THC. But this is a great quote from one of our great teachers, Dr. Donald Abrams, who used to teach at these conferences every year. He's recently retired from his integrative cancer book. For the cancer patient, cannabis has a number of potential benefits, especially for the management of symptoms. It's useful in combating anorexia, chemotherapy-induced nausea, vomiting, pain, insomnia, depression. It might be less potent than other available antiemetics, but for some patients, it's the only agent that works. And it is the only antiemetic that also increases appetite. Inhaled cannabis is more effective than placebo in ameliorating peripheral neuropathy in a number of conditions, and it could be useful in chemotherapy-induced neuropathy. Well, that's been proven that it is useful for that. Now, moving on to treating cancer, I've given this just one slide to tell you what not to do. As you practice clinically and you become known as a cannabis clinician specialist, there will be patients that come in and say, Nothing else has worked. I want to use cannabis for my cancer. And I read about Rick Simpson oil, and I need somebody to help me do this. Rick Simpson oil is a high-potency, THC-rich cannabis oil extract, where the protocol involves using like 800 to 1,000 milligrams a day for 3 months. You know, clinically, we use maybe 5 to 25 milligrams as a dose of cannabinoids in our cannabis, so this is like way up there. And I personally have treated many cancer patients as an anti-cancer therapy, but I would not recommend that anybody do that nor encourage it unless you're really proficient at this and a lot of conditions are met with your patient. It's very expensive and it's very complex. Please don't do it. But we do know that cannabis, including THC, CBD, THCV, CBG, there's about 10 more that are really up there in cell culture and in animal studies that are anti-tumorigenic. They will actually decrease the growth of the tumor. So there's potential there. But again, nobody wants to use those doses unless they're really qualified with it. So that's pretty much it for cancer. Then we're going to go on to anorexia. So anorexia itself, loss of appetite, is not necessarily the primary condition for which patients seek cannabis, but is often a component of many chronic illness conditions for which the patients are seeking cannabis. So we need to understand how cannabis works in appetite regulation. So there are many conditions which patients use cannabis for to stimulate their appetite, not just in chemotherapy or HIV/AIDS, but disinterest in food. Taking too many stimulants. I have many, many, many patients that are on stimulants for ADHD that actually are experiencing weight loss. And cannabis provides a useful alternative to the stimulants, both for the ADHD and for stimulating appetite. A special case happens with anorexia nervosa, and we will review that, because THC isn't that helpful for that, because that's anxious, anxiety-induced lack of appetite. THC does not help anxiety-induced anything, unless it's in a minuscule dose, like we talked about before, very low doses. So we know that the endocannabinoid system is intricately involved in the regulation of hunger hormones, and that the patient's genotype is highly important in determining how an individual person will respond to cannabis and how it affects their appetite. Some people get the munchies, and they really have cravings, and some people can have cannabis, no big deal. I have another family member that had high consumption of cannabis for a very long time, and she recently stopped, and within 2 months she gained 20 pounds. So that's the exact opposite that you would expect. You would expect the cannabis to be stimulating appetite. Well, in her case, because she took it for so long, not only was her appetite lower on the cannabis, but her metabolism storage was lower. Her fat storage was lower on the cannabis as soon as that came off, because you can get a severely disordered endocannabinoid system if chronic use of high-dose THC. Don't do it. Okay, so the stimulating effective THC has been found, again, to be biphasic. Low doses stimulate appetite. High doses decrease feeding, which is what we find clinically. CBD, on the other hand, does not actually stimulate appetite. In some cases, it may be appetite suppressant. But in the particular case of anorexia nervosa patients, it's really useful in treating the anxiety that's interfering with the body's ability to feel permission to eat. So they've done some studies modest reports. With most patients, in most studies, we don't see a big effect on weight gain or appetite stimulation over the long term in any study that's ever been done. You don't see a lot of really overweight, high-use cannabis people walking around. And so that's, again, the issue of tolerance. So if you're going to use cannabis to stimulate appetite, you have to stay at the lower dose range and use intermittent dosing, like 1 or 2 puffs of a vape pen, which is rich in THC, before a meal. That's good. That's 6 puffs a day. Nobody's going to develop a tolerance. But having an edible 3 times a day, keeping your body saturated in THC, you're not even going to eat more. And that's what's been found. Even in the case of anorexia nervosa patients, they found minimal weight gain. Unfortunately, I was not able to find a study that actually measured weight in anorexia nervosa patients who took CBD-rich cannabis. And maybe there is one out there. I wasn't able to find it. That's something that should be done. And then we get back to our pesky terpenes, and it turns out there are certain cultivars that have a terpene called umulene, which is also found in hops. Doesn't really have much of an odor, but that's an appetite suppressant. So if you're wanting to use THC for various other reasons and you don't want to mess with the appetite or the eating, look for a cultivar with umulene. And our last one is going to be PTSD. So depending upon whether it's listed as a condition, PTSD is classically used to cannabis is classically used to treat PTSD for the variety of positive effects it has, including decrease in nightmares, decrease in arousal, decrease in stress, change in perception, and something they don't really talk about, which is, well, decrease in perception also has to include an escape mechanism. It really changes one's perception of reality, which is why most people with PTSD really prefer high THC-rich strains, because it changes their perception of their reality. On the other hand, the cannabinoid THCV, which does almost all those good things, decrease arousal, decrease stress, is really useful for PTSD patients, but it doesn't change their perception. They don't like it, but it really treats symptomatology of PTSD very effectively, and as that cannabinoid becomes more highly available, I would strongly urge patients to look for that for PTSD. So confounding from many studies have tried to indicate that patients with PTSD have increased diagnosis of cannabis use disorder. And many of these people have been diagnosed as cannabis use disorder abusing the product. They're actually using it as a medicine, and that's another whole thing, but I'll give you one sentence. In diagnosing cannabis use disorder, some of the criteria that you have to meet is craving for the substance, using it daily, becoming altered from it. Well, these are the effects of medicines most often. Using it daily, wanting to do anything to get their medicine. Well, what if you're taking blood pressure medicine? You're going to want to use it daily. Your blood pressure is going to be too high. So you have to be really careful with cannabis use disorder and its association over the past 30, 40 years with patients using cannabis. So fortunately, the Veterans Administration has issued a new policy as of December 2017. So I'm practicing for like 10 years before this. And the vets would come in and they'd say, you can't put this in my record. And we can't let the VA know that I'm seeing you, because they'll deny me service, they'll take me off my opiates, and I'll lose my benefits. Well, they actually changed their policy in 2017 and said veterans must not be denied VHA services solely because they are participating in state-approved marijuana programs. We medically, we call cannabis cannabis. But, in paradigms that still consider it a drug of abuse, they'll call it marijuana. Okay, so an important corollary to that decision is cannabis use should never ordinarily be considered a disorder. First, it's a medicine. If you're using your medicine improperly, that's not a disorder. That's a lack of education and communication and patient compliance. And those are all things that must be monitored. So in summary, become trained in the effects and dosing of cannabis for the qualifying conditions in your patient population. Pain is the most common condition for which patients use cannabis. THC is analgesic. CBD and THC are anti-inflammatory and, anti-neuropathic. Insomnia is common for cannabis. Consider THC-rich with myrcene. Depression and anxiety are often co-diagnosed. Know what you're treating. If it's THC, if it's depression, you're going to look towards THC, the appropriate cultivar. If it's anxiety, you're going to look towards CBD, the appropriate cultivar. Muscle spasm responds to both THC and CBD. Spasticity requires internal use. Headaches use THC at the start of the migraine. Topicals are really good for tension. Nausea, vomiting, many cannabinoids are effective. THC, CBD, CBDA. Cancer. Cannabis is most often indicated to treat the symptoms of the cancer or the cancer treatment. Anorexia. THC is good to stimulate appetite. CBD is good as an anxiolytic for anorexia nervosa. In PTSD, both THC and THCV regulate the stress response, as in decrease it. But THC in particular helps to reduce nightmares. Thank you. The references are not on this slide, but we have them because there's too many. There's like 70. And remember, you can't spell healthcare without THC.
While they get together, we'll have a few little Q&A session for them. We're going to get chairs up here, and there you are, Cynthia. I just want to let people know, at 6:30 to 9:30, there is a reception at the Guild. We'll try to have some transportation outside for people who don't know, but it's at 1621 Locust Street. 1621 Locust Street. Sorry for all of those out there in internet land. You're going to miss a good time. But it's at the Guild, 1621 Locust Street, 6:30 to 9:30. Dustin's going to start with a few questions we got online, a comment and some questions. And then I've got Bill here, if someone has a question, raise your hand, and he will get to you with a mic so that we can capture the question. Meantime, can you go get
to the folks that are joining us from online. We have a few comments and a couple questions. Monica Tang said, I'm a pharmacist currently working as a medical science liaison, and my work is to educate Maryland-based licensed clinicians on ECS education, chronic pain, and medical cannabis modalities. I appreciate these wonderful cannabis pearls. That must have been directed to you.
I didn't say the word pearls once.
But your talk was full of them. Mary Lou Eggety said, do we really believe it is the cannabis causing the hyperemesis or the pesticides put on the plants? What do you think, Deb?
I think from personal experience with a lot of my patients, they get really high quality cannabis that's been lab tested, and pesticides are not detectable. So no, not pesticides.
I agree with that. I think that there was some suspicion that neem toxicity could be causing this, and I dug into that research, and you know, at extraordinarily high doses, neem can be toxic and cause vomiting, but nothing like what we're seeing with CHS. So I suspect it has more to do with ECS and autonomic dysregulation. And then Heidi Cooper asked, how does THC and CBD affect dogs depending on their size and other drug interactions? Well, I guess none of us are really experts in that.
Personal experience.
Okay, yeah.
So I had a very nervous animal, and she got to the pot brownies that my teenage kids had laying around, and got really sick. Really sick, you know, somnolent, salivating, hypersalivating, out of it, urinated all over herself, immediately rushed her to the vet, and I was in Santa Cruz, California at the time, and the vet says, another dog high on pot, better get her in here because it's the chocolate that's going to hurt her more than the pot. And basically all they did was diurese it. So in general, my understanding is that cannabis acts on mammals very similarly to the way it acts on humans. And almost everything that we know about how it acts on humans can be extended to its anticipated effect on animals.
Did you have, okay. And yes, I would just back that up. One time on a healer webinar, I had Steven Sittel, who's a veterinary cannabis expert, and we were talking about dosing strategies for various conditions in humans and animals, and it seemed like our perspectives were exactly the same. You know, weight-based dosing was very similar. We, you know, 0.05 to 0.1 milligrams per kilogram is where I would start, you know, and it just seemed very similar. So I think that those go together. Now that's all we have for online, so I'd love for any of you to ask questions, and we have Wandering Mike. Just raise your hand.
Got one here. Right there, Christina. Oh, sure. Thank you all. I've read your books. And I'm a generalist. I'm a lawyer who's never touched an organic chemistry book. But a couple years ago, my wife and I grew type 4 cannabis that doesn't convert its olivetolic acid and geranol pyrophosphate. Notice how I learned how to say that? In other words, the CBGA. And what we found out is by preserving all the trace cannabinoids and their terpenes, that we get an identical protein that actually activates all the receptors, including the GABA and the TRV receptors, because they're looking for an identical protein, and unless they see that carboxyl group, they won't oxidase. They'll just lie there latent. So I'm curious, do you guys see any studies going on of the acid? I know you've talked about it, Dr. Sulak, but the acid form of the molecule preserves all the trace cannabinoids in the combination that the plant needs to protect itself, and it turns out it's got an identical biochemistry. So I'm very interested in if you guys think the acid form of the molecule, which up until now I know wasn't stable, but it is now. We get 20% yields on CBGA. Is that where you guys see the research going? And if so, why?
I think the acidic cannabinoids are very interesting, and we've seen still not nearly enough research on them, but maybe more and more just in the last 5 years or so. They, in general, seem to be more potent in some situations and better absorbed, better distributed into the different compartments of the body, and then often contain some unique properties that their neutral counterparts don't have. And kind of like you were alluding to, it all seems to work really well together. Also, when you have preparations that contain the acidics, that means those preparations haven't been exposed to high levels of heat and pressure, and therefore a lot of the other compounds found in the cannabis plant are probably in there as well. And so you're getting just a more diverse physiologic activity when you use those types of medicines.
So I've had an interest in cannabinoid acids for a long time, and I think I've read almost every paper that's come out about them. And they start back in the I don't know if they start in the 70s. The earliest ones I found were in the 70s. And at that time, they were really oriented toward it not being effective medically. Actually, the earliest papers said, we don't really know what this is. You know, we find it, And that changed over the years where they actually started looking for medical effects. And the primary ones that were found were anti-inflammatory and immune modulatory. There are many others that they're finding now, but they really didn't look, for medical effects until more recently. Anybody else have a question? You want to just stand up and talk loud?
I think for the online people, they need the microphone.
Okay, then. Where is it? Oh, okay. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. Hey, I've got a question regarding, I've talked to other providers and stuff that are in the pain management scene about why some of them will recommend cannabis and why some of them are hesitant to when it shows, cannabis can reduce the amount of opioid and stuff you take. I just wonder if there's any like fear of prosecution, or why are people resistant to do that, or is it just an education thing, or?
I think it's a lack of education on the provider's part. I think, the people that are in this room today are on the forefront. This is still not widely used and widely understood by the medical community. There's still a lot of fear, and there's a lot of fear and a lot of misunderstanding as far as the prescribing versus the recommending. None of you are prescribing it. You can't prescribe it. It's federally illegal. All you can do is recommend it. And under Conant, that is your First Amendment right to do so and to counsel patients on the benefits of any medication that they use, including cannabis. So part of, I think, the way I see it at least is it's a multifaceted approach. We as providers have to break the stigma. We have to make this okay, because it is okay. We have to teach our patients, we have to teach the public about cannabis as medicine, and with increased education and increased knowledge, hopefully providers will start to use it as a medicine.
Yeah, somebody had a response.
I'm Lisa Roark, and I'm a certifying physician here in Missouri, and I just wanted to add, we see a lot of insomnia patients, and you're right, there's not a qualifying condition in Missouri of insomnia. However, there is a condition that is typically treated with addictive substances. That's insomnia, that's opiate addiction, that's alcoholism, that's ADHD, that's anything that you could get hooked on that medication. So although our law in Missouri maybe doesn't line out some of these other conditions, it is open enough to give us some interpretation ability. There's also one medical condition that says any other chronic condition that the physician sees fit. Chronic means something that's been going on for more than 6 months. Does anybody in here have a chronic medical condition? So, just saying, just wanted to add that.
This may be a fairly ignorant question, but you say look for a specific thing, for a specific treatment, a particular terpene profile. How do you do that? Is it labeled? Is there a mass spec on each product? How do we make a recommendation to a patient?
To the best of my knowledge, that depends upon the progress in individual states as far as their requirements for lab testing and how sophisticated they are and what the standard of practice is. In general, terpenes are not listed. And that's been the case almost the whole time that I've been practicing. Sometimes products will say they have certain terpenes. So, I tell my patients to use their nose. Really, when I think the terpene's important, I say, get the raw flower. Here's an information on how you make a tincture. If you don't want to smoke it, you can vape it, or you can make your own tincture, or you can, making edibles is risky because as soon as you use heat, the terpenes evaporate. So, we are on the forefront, and that is coming up, and hopefully there will be terpene testing required at some point.
Hold on. Excuse me, sir.
Yeah. Another way the practitioners and patients need to demand this. In Missouri, we're starting to see some terpene profiles being done by labs and being put on products, but patients need to demand it and the providers need to demand it. The market will respond. But it costs them a lot of money. It costs them about $175 to run terpene profiles on a product. And there will be somebody from a lab here tomorrow that can answer a whole lot of lab questions, but I think we need to demand better.
I was also just interjecting about that even with the flower, some of the lighter weight monoterpenes like beta-myrcene that Dr. Malka referenced, they'll evaporate with storage and with heat. So it's tricky.
Hi, this question is for Dr. Malka. You mentioned with a tension headache to rub the balm on the back of your neck. Is some of that being absorbed, like if you're rubbing it all over and getting it on your jugular vein, are you getting some of the THC in your bloodstream?
That's one of those little bit more technical questions, but it's really useful. Not all topicals are alike. And depending upon whether you want to treat surface, dermal, epidermal treatments, you use salves. There are certain topical preparations that have solvents or carriers that allow the active ingredients to penetrate through those layers. And, the best thing is to hopefully speak to the dispensary people and ask them which ones get through the skin. We have room for maybe 2 more questions.
Hi. I can say it. Can you help explain how THC and cannabis can help with obesity when it already seems like an stimulated system and down-regulated, how THC can help upregulate?
I missed it. How the THC can help with, what was that?
With obesity.
Obesity.
It seems
Gotcha.
counterintuitive that it would help.
Okay, right. So that situation that I described, which is based on some evidence, but I would say not proven, is this idea that in obesity, some people will have higher levels of circulating endocannabinoids, which kind of create a tolerance-like effect, a downregulation of CB1 receptors because they're being overstimulated. Well, THC is a partial agonist at CB1, so if something's overstimulating it and THC comes in, it actually can block that overstimulation. It takes the place of whatever's turning on that receptor, but turns it on with less intensity, making it less likely to be downregulated. THCV might be an even better choice in that situation because of its gentle antagonist activity. And then also, if you're treating someone with obesity that has other conditions, if they're sleeping better, if they have less stress, their cortisol's lower, their blood sugar's lower, they're less pain, so they're more active, they're participating in exercise. I mean, there's just lots of indirect benefits as well. Maybe their emotions are better, less emotional eating, and so forth.
Last question.
I have 2, but they're quick.
You're fired.
Is there any way to challenge the legality of the definition of Schedule 1 as it relates to marijuana due to the medical evidence that is existing?
Great question. The last time that anybody asked the DEA officially to reschedule cannabis was in 2016, and it was ultimately unsuccessful yet again. Call your legislators, call your representatives, make your voice heard on the state level, make your voice heard on the national level. Figure out who represents you in Congress and wear out their phone, wear out their email. When they come in Monday morning, oh great, it's another email from Northcutt about CBD and, but that's how we make change. Technically, the Attorney General of the United States can single-handedly decide to reschedule or deschedule a medication. Thank God that didn't happen with Mr. Sessions because we were a little concerned. And he basically revoked the Cole memos and the Ogden memo and told the DOJ to do their job. And they just kind of went, okay, well, yeah, we're doing our job. Yeah. But no, it needs to be addressed. But thus far, no luck.
Yeah, I know I keep hearing the MORE Act, and I know that it's hard to get people to vote on the bills and to act on them, so I didn't know if there was just another legal outlet you could use to do that. Okay, second and last one. Are there any quantitative biomarkers found through testing to determine ECS dysfunction or deficiencies, and how can you point somebody in the right direction as far as minor cannabinoids or major cannabinoids and terpene profiles based on that quantitative data?
So, to my knowledge, right now there's no commercially available testing. There's been research papers where they test for anandamide. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to test for circulating 2-AG. It's broken down rapidly, but PEA and OEA are other common ones that are tested for. I don't think we can use those clinically. There was two recent papers came out. Bonnie Goldstein was a co-author on both of them, using salivary biomarkers, not necessarily to measure ECS function, but to measure a lot of different things, like 70, 80 different markers that very highly correlated with improvement symptomatically in children with autism that were treated with a wide variety of cannabis combinations. So I think that line of research is probably going to take off, but right now there's no way of measuring. And then I would also say peripheral, like blood levels, may be like a false lead, because what's happening in the blood with endocannabinoid levels may not reflect the tissue or the organ that you're most curious about. A comment.
Okay, so Michelle Morris, she's a member of ACNA. She is certified for animal care. Whoever was needing that about animals and CBD, THC, she's somebody to reach out on that. Second of all, in Texas, the doctors do prescribe, because the Texas legislation said, if you're telling us this is a medicine, then you will prescribe like all your other medicines. So Texas is a little different when it comes to that. My question is for you, though, what legally can the people in Texas do to get their EMR changed when they put down cannabis use as a drug substance and not a medication? What legally can they do to their doctor to make them change it?
Beat them about the head and shoulders. I think you should show up at their doorstep, and yeah, absolutely. I'm somewhat familiar with Texas law, and I'm generally, because of the Schedule I status federally, I will look into that, what you said, because that is somewhat confusing, and sometimes I think states they use terminology that isn't adequately defined or isn't accurate, and they may not, somebody may not understand the difference between a prescription and a recommendation. But under federal law, you can't prescribe it because it's a Schedule I. You can't prescribe LSD to a patient either.
Right, and that's what we've got 600 doctors in the whole state of Texas now that have put their license on the line to prescribe, which is showing where Texas is wanting to go. You just can't get the legislation to do it. So, but there's 600 people doctors that are putting their license on the line every time they prescribe.
And that's what it's going to take. It's going to take us all standing up and continuing to fight.
Really quickly, so the evolution of this process, because California 1996 is when the cannabis was approved medically, they used to revoke your license or suspend it if you even recommended its use. Then the medical board came along and said, okay, you can recommend it, but the California Medical Association said, you shall not prescribe it, and these are the reasons why. Well, then all these other states that didn't have this long history with this stigma of getting it through and, getting licenses suspended, they started saying, you have to prescribe it. Texas isn't the only one. In New York, they have to write a prescription of exactly what to use. Yeah, so I think what's happening is that just in a matter of use in different states, they're just following ethics a little better, because the problem is you cannot ethically tell a patient to use something and not give them the benefit of telling them your best knowledge of how to use it. So I think we're moving in the right direction. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. For those of you here, Deb and Dustin will be at the reception, and they will be able to sign books should anyone want either of their books.